The needle went through her thumb before it went through the fabric. Abigail Mercer did not cry out. She had learned that pain announced too loudly only invited more of it. She pressed her thumb to her lips, tasted copper, and kept sewing because tomorrow she would stand before a stranger and beg him not to turn her away. If you're just joining me, welcome. Please tap subscribe and follow this channel so you don't miss a moment of Abigail's story. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every one, and I want to know how far this story has traveled. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the Decker gate a little after noon, and the dust it kicked up hung in the air like it didn't want to settle either. Abigail climbed down without help because there was no help offered, and stood for a moment just breathing in air that smelled like scorched grass and dry wood. She was not a small woman. Her body was wide through the hips and heavy in the arms, soft in places the world liked to comment on, and strong in places the world liked to forget. She had heard every name for it, heard them whispered behind church pews, heard them muttered by men who thought fat women should be grateful for any glance at all. She had stopped flinching from the words a long time ago. She had not stopped hearing them. In her hand, she carried a small case with 3 sewing needles, a spool of black thread, and $11 folded into a handkerchief. In her coat pocket, worn soft from handling, was a foreclosure notice from the bank in Abilene, informing her that the house she had shared with her husband, the house he had mortgaged without telling her the house that held every memory she had left, now belonged to a man named Harlan Cutter. She had nowhere else to go. She had answered an advertisement in a Kansas paper housekeeper wanted. Ranch work. Room and board. No pay disclosed until trial period complete. Decker Ranch, Western Territory. The man waiting at the gate did not step forward to greet her. He stood with his arms crossed, hat low over eyes that studied her the way a buyer studies a horse he suspects has gone lame. He was tall, sun-hardened, a man built by labor rather than leisure, and there was nothing warm in the way he looked at her. "You're the one who answered the notice," he said. It wasn't a question. "Abigail Mercer," she said, and held out her hand. He did not take it. "Caleb Decker," he said. "This is my land." She let her hand fall back to her side, slow, so it wouldn't look like retreat. He looked past her shoulder at the empty road, as though expecting someone else to step down from the coach, a husband perhaps, or a father, someone who might have sent her here properly with a letter of introduction with credentials. "Where's your people?" he asked. "Buried," she said. "All of them." Something flickered in his face, not softness. Recognition maybe of a fact he understood too well himself. "You know anything about ranch work? I know how to fix what's broken," she said. He almost laughed. It came out as a short breath through his nose, not unkind exactly, but close enough to it that her spine straightened. "Can you sew?" he asked, and there was something sharp in it, something testing. "Can you cook, keep books, manage a house that's 3 men deep in debt and 1 bad season from losing everything? Or are you going to slow me down?" She looked past him at the ranch behind the gate. The fence line sagged in 3 places she could count from where she stood. The porch steps had a board missing the gap, black and gaping like a pulled tooth. The barn door hung crooked on one hinge. Everything about the place spoke of a man trying to hold together something that was slipping through his fingers faster than he could grip it. "I can fix what's breaking," she said again, quieter this time. And she meant the house, and she meant something else too. Something she didn't say out loud, because 6 months ago she had been a woman who had a husband and a home and a future, and now she was a woman standing at a stranger's gate with $11 and a torn hem. And if she said the truth of what she meant, she wasn't sure she could keep her voice steady. Caleb studied her a long moment. She did not look away. She had learned that too, in the burying and the packing and the leaving, that looking away was how people decided you had already lost. 30 days, he said finally. "You don't earn your keep in 30 days. You're on the next coach out. I don't carry dead weight on this land, not out of cruelty, out of arithmetic." "Understood," she said. He turned and walked toward the house without waiting to see if she'd follow, which told her something too, that he expected obedience more than he expected companionship, that he had built walls around himself the way a man builds walls around a well gone dry to keep anyone from falling in and finding out there was nothing left at the bottom. She followed him anyway. She had nowhere else to go, and stubbornness had gotten her further than kindness ever had. The house was worse inside than the fences suggested outside. Dust sat thick on every surface. A ledger book lay open on the kitchen table, its pages scrawled with numbers that didn't add up. Even at a glance, she could see 3 separate arithmetic errors just standing in the doorway, small mistakes compounding into a much larger one. The stove had a crack running along its side. The curtains, what remained of them, hung in shreds that let in more light than they blocked. "Room's through there," Caleb said, jerking his chin toward a narrow door off the kitchen. "Used to be for hired help. Ain't much." "It's more than I have now," she said. And that silenced him for a moment because he heard the truth in it and didn't know what to do with truth that plain. That first night, she did not sleep. She lay on a straw mattress in a room the size of a pantry and listened to the house breathe every creak of the wood, every settle of the foundation. And beneath it all, faintly the sound of a man pacing in another room, back and forth, like a man trying to walk his way out of a debt he couldn't outrun. At dawn she rose before he did, and went looking for the source of the largest crack in the porch board, because she had learned from her husband, who had been a carpenter before the fever took him, that rot spreads from wherever water sits longest. She found it at the porch's northeast corner, where the roof gutter had broken years ago, and rain had been pooling and seeping into the wood ever since. She found a hammer and a handful of nails in the barn, found 2 boards that weren't yet beyond saving, and by the time Caleb Decker came out onto his porch with his coffee, she was on her knees, prying up the rotted plank with her bare hands. He stopped in the doorway and stared. "What in God's name are you doing?" "Fixing what's breaking," she said without looking up. "That's not sewing." "No," she agreed. "It's carpentry. I know some. My husband taught me." He set his coffee down on the rail slow, like a man deciding whether to be angry or something else he didn't have a name for yet. "You could have asked. You'd have said no." "I might have," he admitted, and there was the faintest thing in his voice, not quite amusement, but its distant cousin. She pulled the rotted board free and set it aside, and underneath, exactly as she'd guessed, was a soft, blackened patch of joist that would need replacing before the whole corner gave way under someone's weight. "This whole corner's going to fall through," she said. "Maybe not this month, but soon. And whoever's standing on it when it does is going to break something worse than a board." Caleb crouched down beside her close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and the leather of his gloves, and looked at the damage, like he was seeing his own house for the first time in years. "I've been meaning to get to that," he said. "For how long?" He didn't answer, and the silence told her everything that he had been meaning to get to. A great many things for a great many months that the ranch had been sliding out from under him, one broken board and one bad number at a time, and that he had been too proud, or too tired, or too alone to ask for help fixing any of it. "I'll need more lumber," she said. "And I looked at your ledger. Your interest calculation on the note from the cattleman's bank is wrong. Not by a little. By enough that in a year it'll cost you $80 you don't owe." His head turned sharp toward her. "You read my books. They were open on the table. I wasn't hunting through drawers." "That's not your business. It's the business of a woman who's going to be living under this roof and eating whatever this ranch can afford to feed her," she said, and she said it steady without apology, because she had decided somewhere between Abilene and this porch that she was done being a woman who apologized for seeing clearly. "You can be angry at me for looking, or you can let me help you fix it. But you can't have both the anger and the ignorance, Mr. Decker. Not for much longer. Not with a note that size." He stood up so fast, his knee cracked against the porch rail, and for a moment she thought she'd pushed too far. Thought he was going to send her back down that road with her $11 and her torn hem, and nothing gained for the trying. Instead, he said low, "Show me." They sat at the kitchen table while the coffee went cold, and she walked him through the numbers with a pencil stub and the back of an old feed receipt, showing him where the bank's clerk, or someone claiming to work for the bank, had compounded the interest incorrectly. Quietly, month over month, in a way that would have taken years to notice if nobody was looking closely, and by then, it would have been too late to argue. "Who wrote up this note?" she asked. "This isn't standard bank paper." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Man named Cutter, Harlan Cutter. He financed half the ranches in this valley when the bank in town wouldn't. Everybody said he was generous." Abigail went very still. "Cutter?" she repeated. "You know him." "He owns the house I used to live in," she said quietly. "He foreclosed on my husband's mortgage 2 weeks after the funeral. Papers I never signed. Terms I was never shown until it was already done." The kitchen went silent, except for the tick of a clock that ran 10 minutes slow. "That's not a coincidence," Caleb said finally. "No," she agreed. "I don't believe it is." Outside, the summer heat was already climbing the kind of dry Kansas heat that cracked earth and shortened tempers, and somewhere out past the fence line, a hawk called once and went quiet, and Abigail Mercer sat at a stranger's table with a stranger's ruined books in front of her, and felt for the first time in 6 months something other than grief. She felt useful. And underneath the useful quieter something that frightened her more, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Caleb Decker did not thank her. Men like him didn't know how, not yet, not after years of holding a failing ranch together, with nothing but stubbornness and a refusal to ask anyone for anything. But he pushed the ledger toward her instead of pulling it away, and that she understood was its own kind of thank you. 30 days, he said again, quieter now, more like a promise to himself than a warning to her. 30 days, she agreed. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that 30 days was not nearly long enough to fix a ranch that had been breaking for years, and that some things, once you started fixing them, didn't let you walk away, even when the deadline came due. By midweek, word had reached town that Caleb Decker had hired a housekeeper, and word in a town that small always came with opinions attached. Abigail rode in with him for supplies, sitting stiff and proud on the wagon bench, and felt the stairs before she even climbed down. Women in the general store pulling their children a little closer, a clerk's eyes dragging over her wide hips and heavy arms with open judgment. A woman near the flour barrels, murmuring to her neighbor just loud enough to be heard, "Decker must be desperate taking in a woman built like that." Abigail kept her spine straight and her chin level, and did not give them the satisfaction of a flinch. She had buried a husband. She had lost a house. She had crossed half a territory with $11 to her name. She was not going to be undone by women who had never had to be brave a day in their soft, comfortable lives. But one woman did not join the murmuring. She stepped out from behind the counter, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, wearing black she'd clearly worn a long while. "Eleanor Pruitt," she said, offering her hand plainly the way Caleb had refused to. "I run the place next to Decker Land. Don't mind them." She tilted her head toward the murmuring women. "They talk loud because their own houses are quieter than they'd like." Abigail shook her hand, grateful in a way she didn't trust herself to say out loud. "You're the one fixing his ledgers," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question either. Apparently nothing in this territory was. "Trying to. Good." Eleanor's eyes went hard for just a moment. "Somebody should have looked at those books years ago. That man Cutter's been picking these ranches clean one bad winter at a time. My husband signed papers with him before he passed. I didn't understand what I'd agreed to until the interest doubled." "That's exactly what happened to me," Abigail said quietly. "Before I came here." Eleanor studied her with new interest. "Then maybe you're not just here to sew hems and scrub floors, Mrs. Mercer." "No," Abigail said. "I don't believe I am." They rode back to the ranch as the sun dropped low and orange over the fence line, and Caleb was quiet the whole way, jaw working like he was chewing on something he hadn't decided whether to say. Finally, near the gate, he spoke. "They talk about you like that in town. They talk about everyone like that in every town," she said. "I stopped listening a long time ago." "Doesn't mean it doesn't land." She looked at him, surprised he'd noticed, surprised he'd said it out loud. "It lands," she admitted. "I just don't let it stop my hands from working. He nodded slowly, like that was an answer that satisfied something in him he hadn't expected to have satisfied, and they didn't speak again until the wagon rolled through the gate and the ranch came into view. Fence-sagging porch, half-fixed barn door still crooked, but somehow in the space of a week, looking less like a place that was dying, and more like a place that was simply waiting for someone to finish the work. Harlan Cutter had heard, same as everyone else in the valley, that Caleb Decker had brought in a woman who could read numbers. He did not like it one bit. 2 days later he rode through the Decker gate himself, uninvited, dressed sharper than a ranch visit called for, his black coat too fine for dust, and heat his smile too practiced to mean anything good. Abigail was on the porch beating the rot smell out of an old rug when she saw him coming, and something in her chest went cold and still before her mind even caught up to why. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, tipping his hat, and the sound of her name in his mouth made her skin crawl, because the last time a man had said it in that same silky tone, he had been handing her a foreclosure notice across a bank counter and calling it regrettable business. "Small territory, isn't it? Didn't expect to find you out this far west." "Mr. Cutter," she said, and did not lower the rug, did not offer her hand, did not give him 1 inch of the softness he was clearly fishing for. Caleb came around the side of the barn at the sound of hooves and stopped dead when he saw who it was. His whole body going rigid, the way a dog's does when it scents something wrong on the wind. "Cutter," he said. "Nobody sent for you. Just being neighborly." Cutter swung down from his horse, unhurried, a man who had never once in his life felt unwelcome and didn't intend to start feeling it now. "Heard you took in some help. Thought I'd pay my respects." His eyes slid over to Abigail again, lingering a beat too long on the width of her, the plainness of her dress, like he was cataloging something to use later. "Didn't realize you two had history, Mrs. Mercer." "We don't," Abigail said. "You made sure of that when you took my house?" "Business, ma'am, just business." He smiled wider, and it did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "Your husband signed those terms of his own free will." "My husband signed papers he didn't understand, because the man selling them to him made sure he wouldn't," she said, and her voice didn't shake, though her hands hidden in the folds of the rug had gone tight as fists. "I've seen your handwriting before, Mr. Cutter. I recognized it the moment I opened Mr. Decker's ledger." The smile flickered, just for a second, just long enough that Caleb saw it too. "That's a serious thing to say, ma'am," Cutter said, softer now, the pleasantness gone thin at the edges. "Careless talk can hurt a woman's reputation in a town this size, especially a woman with no husband left to speak for her." "I don't need a husband to speak for me," Abigail said. "I can read a column of numbers well enough to speak for myself." Caleb stepped up beside her, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers, and said nothing at all. The silence itself was the message: she is not standing here alone. Cutter's gaze moved between them, recalculating. "I came to remind you, Decker, that your note comes due for review at the end of the season." He said all business again, the false warmth stripped away like a coat he no longer needed. "I'd hate for anything to interfere with a fair renewal. Wouldn't want anyone stirring up trouble that isn't there." "There's plenty of trouble here already," Caleb said. "Some of it's got your name on it." "Careful," Cutter said, mounting back up unhurried, every motion a performance of a man who believed he could not lose. "A ranch this deep in debt doesn't survive on pride alone, Decker, and a woman with a foreclosure already behind her." His eyes cut once more to Abigail, cold, now no pretense of kindness left in them at all, doesn't get many more chances before people stop believing she's unlucky and start believing she's cursed. He rode off without waiting for a reply, dust rising behind his horse, the same way it had risen behind Abigail's stagecoach the day she arrived. "He's not wrong that the note comes due," Caleb said finally low. "End of summer. If the numbers don't add up in his favor by then, he can call it and take the land. Then we make sure the numbers add up in yours," Abigail said. And there was something new in her voice now. Something harder than grief. Something that had been buried under 6 months of mourning and was only now climbing back up into the light. "He's done this before. Eleanor Pruitt's husband. Probably others in this valley too. Men who signed papers they didn't understand. Widows who didn't know what questions to ask. If we can prove the pattern, not just fix your one note, but prove the pattern he can't just call your debt whenever it suits him, A judge would have to look at every note he's written the same way. Caleb looked at her like he was seeing something shift into focus, some shape he hadn't let himself hope for. "You'd do that," he said. "Take that on. After everything he already took from you." "Especially after everything he already took from me," she said. "I couldn't stop him the first time. I didn't understand what was happening until it already happened. I understand now." That evening supper passed mostly quiet, but it was a different quiet than before, the quiet of two people who had just recognized without saying it plainly that they were standing on the same side of something now. Caleb mended harness leather by lamplight. Abigail copied numbers from the ledger into a fresh notebook column by column building, something that looked more each night less like housekeeping and more like a case. Near midnight, when the lamp had burned low and the crickets outside had gone from a roar to a murmur, Caleb set down his awl and looked at her across the table for longer than was comfortable. "Why didn't you tell me straight off?" he asked. "That Cutter was the man who took your house." "Because I didn't know if you'd believe me," she said honestly. "Or if you'd think I came here carrying trouble I meant to bring with me." "You didn't bring the trouble," he said. "Trouble was already sitting in my ledger before you ever stepped off that coach. You just knew how to read it." She looked up at him then, and for the first time since the gate, since Can You Sew, since the flat suspicion in his eyes that first afternoon, she saw something else there entirely. Not doubt, not calculation, but the beginning, small and unfamiliar, of trust. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Mercer," he said, standing gathering the harness leather under one arm. "Tomorrow we start on the fence line, and after that—" He paused at the door hand on the frame, not quite looking back at her. "After that, we start on Cutter." Abigail sat alone at the table a long while after he'd gone, the ledger open in front of her, and thought about the woman who had climbed down from that stagecoach a week ago with $11 and nothing left to lose. She did not feel like that woman anymore. Outside, the Kansas summer night pressed dark over the valley, over the sagging fences, and the half-fixed porch, over a ranch that had spent years quietly dying and had only just begun fighting back and out past the ridge, in a house far grander than anything he had earned. Honestly. Harlan Cutter reviewed a stack of notes with familiar names on them, and drew a single line through the margin beside Decker's, the way a man marks something he intends to deal with before it becomes a problem he can't control. The fence line took them 4 days to walk end to end, and by the second day, Abigail's palms had split open in 3 places from the wire, and she wrapped them in strips torn from an old flour sack, and kept working, because stopping meant falling behind, and falling behind meant 30 days would run out before the ranch had a chance to hold. Caleb noticed the strips of cloth before she'd said a word about them. "Let me see," he said, and it wasn't a request. "It's nothing. Let me see Mrs. Mercer." She held out her hands, and he unwrapped the cloth with more gentleness than she expected from fingers that had spent a lifetime pulling wire taut and driving posts into hard ground. The cuts were raw-crusted at the edges, the kind that would fester in this heat if left untended. "You should have said something." "I didn't want you thinking I was already looking for reasons to quit." "I wasn't looking for reasons to send you off," he said low, not quite meeting her eyes as he said it, and something in the admission cost him more than the words themselves let on. "Wrap them proper this time. There's salve in the kitchen behind the flour tin." He did not offer to fetch it for her, and she did not ask him to, but the fact that he'd told her where it was, that he'd noticed, that he'd thought of it at all, sat warm in her chest the rest of that afternoon, warmer than the sun that beat down without mercy on both their necks. By the 5th day, the fence was mended in every place she could reach, and Caleb stood at the gate looking down the line of tight new wire like a man looking at proof that something in his life could still be fixed. "Ledger's next," Abigail said. "Ledger's been next for a week." "Ledger's been broken for longer than a week. It can wait 1 more day." He almost smiled. She was starting to learn the shape of it before it fully arrived. A small tightening at the corner of his mouth, gone almost before she could be sure she'd seen it. That evening, working by lamplight at the kitchen table, she found the second forged entry. It was smaller than the first, easy to miss, if she hadn't already been looking hard at every line Cutter's hand had touched a payment recorded as received in March that Caleb swore flat and certain he had never made. "I paid in April," he said. "I remember because I sold 2 head of cattle to cover it, and the buyer haggled me down, and I was sick about it for a week." "The ledger says March, and it says you paid $10 more than what you're telling me." "Then the ledger's lying." "The ledger doesn't lie," Abigail said. "People do. Ledgers just carry what people put in them." She turned the page toward him, tapped the entry with one split healing finger. "This is the same hand as the interest miscalculation. Cutter wrote this line himself. He's not just charging you wrong interest, Caleb. He's inventing payments you never made, so that when you try to prove what you actually paid his numbers and your memory won't match, and a judge is going to trust paper over a rancher's word every time." Caleb sat back hard enough that his chair creaked. "That's fraud," he said. "Plain fraud. It's fraud if we can prove it's a pattern. One mistake a judge calls an accident. A dozen mistakes across a dozen ranches, all bending the same direction, all favoring the same man, that's not accident. That's a system. How do we prove a dozen? We ask a dozen people," she said, starting with Eleanor Pruitt. They rode to the Pruitt place the next morning, and Eleanor met them at her own gate with flour still on her hands from morning bread, and when Abigail explained what she'd found. The forged March payment, the miscalculated interest, the handwriting she now recognized on sight. Eleanor went pale, and then just as fast went hard. "I have my husband's old note somewhere," she said. "I never threw it out, couldn't bring myself to. Come inside." They found it in a tin box beneath her bed, yellowed and creased from years of folding and unfolding, and Abigail spread it flat on the kitchen table and read it line by line, while Eleanor stood with her arms crossed tight over her chest, like she was holding herself together by force. There it was, the same compounding error, the same careful, deliberate miscalculation dressed up in language complicated enough that a grieving widow wouldn't think to question it. 2 ranches, Caleb said quietly. Same hand, same trick. "There'll be more," Abigail said. "Eleanor, who else in this valley took a note from Cutter in the last 5 years?" Eleanor's jaw worked. "The Whitfields. The Ashford place before they sold up and left. Old man Torres before he passed." She stopped and something crossed her face that looked almost like guilt. "I should have said something years ago. I thought it was my own foolishness. I thought I'd misunderstood the terms because I wasn't smart enough to follow them." "You weren't foolish," Abigail said, and she said it with a force that surprised even her because she was saying it to Eleanor, and she was saying it to herself, to the woman who had signed papers of her own, once trusting a man's smile more than she'd trusted her own instincts. "He built these notes to be misunderstood. That's not weakness in the people who signed them. That's the whole design." Eleanor's eyes went wet and she turned away quick to hide it, busying her hands with the flour tin, and Caleb looked at Abigail across the kitchen with something in his face that hadn't been there at the gate a week ago. Something that looked, if she let herself believe it, almost like awe. They rode home with Eleanor's note wrapped carefully in cloth, tucked beside Caleb's own papers, and the beginnings of a case that was no longer just one man's bad debt, but a pattern with a name attached to it. The heat that summer had teeth in it. By the second week of July, the well behind the barn had dropped low enough that Caleb rationed water for the stock, and the grass in the far pasture had gone the color of old paper, and every rancher in the valley watched the sky for clouds that refused to come. "Drought's coming," Caleb said one evening, standing at the fence, looking out over ground that cracked like old leather under his boots. "Bad one from the look of it. Cutter knows it too. A dry summer means more ranchers falling behind on their notes, more land he can call due." "Then we move faster," Abigail said. "Faster isn't always possible with drought, Mrs. Mercer. Cattle don't care how fast a woman can copy numbers into a ledger." "No," she agreed. "But a judge doesn't care how much rain fell either. He cares whether the paper in front of him tells the truth. That part at least is something I can control." He looked at her a long moment, dust settling on his boots, sun dropping low and red behind him, and said quiet, "You talk about control like it's a thing a person can hold on to." "It's the only thing I have left to hold on to," she said. "I lost my husband. I lost my house. I'm not going to lose the one thing I'm good at, too." Something shifted in his face. Not pity she was relieved to see, because she couldn't have stomached pity from him, but understanding plain and unadorned, the kind that comes from a man who has lost enough of his own to recognize the shape of someone else's loss without needing it. Explained further. That was the night the barn caught fire. It started small. A lantern knocked maybe, or a spark from a chimney flew. Nobody had checked in months, and by the time Abigail smelled smoke through her narrow window, the whole northeast corner of the barn was already lit orange against the dark. She didn't stop to think. She was up and running before her mind had fully caught the danger, screaming Caleb's name into the house, and he came out of his room, half-dressed, boots in hand, and together they ran for the well with buckets that felt absurdly small against a fire that was already climbing toward the hayloft. "The horses!" Caleb shouted, and Abigail didn't wait to be told. Twice she ran straight into the smoke, coughing eyes streaming, and found the latch on the first stall, by feel alone, and the horse bolted past her into the night, and she found the second latch and the third, moving fast, moving on instinct, not stopping to be afraid until every animal was clear, and only then did her knees nearly buckle from the smoke she'd swallowed. Caleb hauled her out by the arm, just as a support beam cracked and came down where she'd been standing seconds before. "Are you hurt?" he said, and it wasn't really a question. It was closer to a demand. His hands gripping her shoulders hard enough to bruise his eyes, moving over her face and her arms, like he was cataloging every possible injury before she'd even had a chance to answer. "I'm fine," she managed, coughing. "The horses are out. That's what matters." "You could have died in there." "I didn't." "That's not the same thing as you being careful," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way that surprised them both. And for a moment, standing in the orange light of a barn burning down around the wreckage of everything he'd worked for, he looked at her like a man who had just realized how much more he stood to lose than lumber and hay. They lost the barn's northeast third before Eleanor and two of her hired men arrived, with more buckets and a wagon of water barrels, and by dawn the fire was out. And what remained was black and smoking and half collapsed, and Caleb stood in the ruin of it, with his hands on his hips, jaw tight, saying nothing for a long, long time. "Was it an accident?" Abigail asked finally. "I don't know," Caleb said. "I check that flue every week. Checked it Tuesday. It was sound. You think it was Cutter?" "I think a man who's about to lose a fraud case doesn't sit quiet and wait for the paperwork to catch him," Caleb said. "I think a fire in my barn 2 days after we start gathering evidence against him is a strange kind of accident. We can't prove that." "No," he agreed, grim. "But I don't believe in accidents that convenient. Not anymore." Word of the fire reached town within a day, and with it came a fresh wave of talk, some of it sympathetic, most of it not. Abigail heard secondhand through Eleanor that certain women in town were saying the fire was a sign that Decker's luck had turned the day he let a cursed woman onto his land, that a widow who couldn't keep her own house from foreclosure had no business advising a man on how to keep his. She said nothing about it to Caleb. She had learned in 6 months of grief and a week of ranch work that some poison was better left uncarried into rooms where it could still do damage. But Caleb heard it anyway from one of the hired men who'd helped fight the fire, and he rode into town the next morning with his jaw set in a line Abigail hadn't seen before, and came back 3 hours later saying nothing about where he'd gone. Though Eleanor mentioned careful and sideways that Caleb Decker had stood in the middle of the general store that morning and told the whole room loud enough for everyone to hear that any man or woman still spreading talk about Mrs. Mercer being cursed could take it up with him directly, because the only curse he'd seen on his land lately wore a black coat and called himself a moneylender. Abigail didn't know what to do with the warmth that spread through her chest when she heard that. She hadn't asked him to defend her. She hadn't expected it. And some old tired part of her, the part that had learned the hard way that men's kindness usually came with strings, wanted to be suspicious of it. But she looked at him that evening mending a bridle strap by lamplight, same as every other night, quiet and steady and entirely unbothered with himself for having done it, and she understood that this was simply who he was underneath the walls, a man who fixed what needed fixing. Whether it was a fence, a ledger, or a woman's name dragged through mud she hadn't earned. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Do what?" "Tell the whole town off on my account." "I didn't tell the whole town off," he said. "I told them the truth. There's a difference." "Eleanor said you were fairly loud about it." "Eleanor exaggerates." "Eleanor," Abigail said, "does not exaggerate. Not once in the whole time I've known her." That got the almost smile out of him again. The real one this time lasting a whole 2 seconds before he ducked his head back to his mending, and Abigail found herself smiling too, sitting across a scarred kitchen table, from a man who 2 weeks ago had asked if she could sew, like it was an insult, and was now defending her name to a room full of strangers. It should have frightened her how quickly the ground had shifted beneath her. It did a little. But mostly, it felt like the first solid thing she'd stood on since the fever took her husband, and she was not. She decided going to apologize for wanting to keep standing on it. The barn rebuilding gave them 10 days of hard, unglamorous work, hauling charred wood salvaging, what timber could be saved, ordering new lumber they couldn't quite afford, and Abigail found herself working the saw and hammer alongside the 2 hired hands as easily as she worked the ledger by night, her hands blistering fresh under the ones that had only just begun to heal. It was during this stretch that Cutter sent his second visit. Not himself this time, but a lawyer, thin and nervous-eyed, carrying papers that claimed the note's terms required immediate partial repayment, given what he called, delicately, recent instability on the property. "The fire wasn't instability," Caleb said, standing on the half-rebuilt porch with his arms crossed. "The fire was an act of God, or an act of somebody with a grudge, and either way, it's got nothing to do with my note. Mr. Cutter believes it's prudent to reassess risk," the lawyer said, sweating in the heat, clearly uncomfortable with his own errand. "He's within his rights under Section 4 of the agreement." "Show me Section 4, Abigail said, stepping forward, and the lawyer's eyes flicked to her with open surprise, the kind of surprise that assumed a woman built like her had no business reading contract law. He showed her anyway because he had nothing better to do with the awkward silence, and Abigail read it twice, slow, her lips moving faintly over the legal language, the way she used to read her husband's letters, searching for what was really being said beneath what was written. "Section 4 allows reassessment in the event of proven negligence," she said finally. "Not suspected, proven. Has your office proven negligence, or is Mr. Cutter simply hoping we won't read closely enough to notice the difference?" The lawyer's mouth opened and then closed again. "I'll relay your position to Mr. Cutter," he said, stiff, and rode off without further argument, and Caleb turned to look at her with something between disbelief and open delight. "You just sent a lawyer packing with a sentence." "I sent a lawyer packing with the truth," she said. "Lawyers only win when the person across from them doesn't know how to read the same page they're reading." "Where'd you learn contract language like that?" "My husband," she said, quieter now, some of the light going out of her voice. "He read everything twice. Taught me to do the same. I just didn't read the mortgage on our own house twice the one time it mattered most because I trusted the bank clerk who told me it was standard paper." She looked away out over the half-rebuilt barn over the scorched ground beyond it. "I've been making up for that mistake every day since." Caleb didn't say anything for a moment, and when he did, his voice was low, rougher than usual. "That mistake wasn't yours to carry, Abigail." It was the first time he'd said her given name instead of Mrs. Mercer, and the sound of it in his mouth landed somewhere in her chest. She hadn't expected warm and sudden and a little frightening, and she didn't trust herself to answer right away, so she busied her hands with a stack of lumber that didn't need moving until the moment passed, and her voice steadied enough to speak again. The following week brought the twist that changed the shape of everything. A rider came through with a letter for Eleanor forwarded from a lawyer's office. 2 counties over, a man named Franklin Reyes, who had once handled land disputes for the territorial court before retiring to a smaller practice, and who Eleanor explained with something like hope. Creeping back into her voice for the first time in years, had a reputation for taking on cases against predatory lenders when the evidence was strong enough to be worth his trouble. Eleanor had written to him weeks earlier before Abigail had even arrived on nothing more than a hunch and a grudge she'd carried since her husband's death. And the letter that came back said, Reyes was willing to review documentation if they could gather enough of it to make the trip worthwhile. How much is enough? Caleb asked. He says 3 or more separate notes, all bearing evidence of the same fraudulent pattern, would be sufficient to bring formal inquiry. Eleanor read aloud. We have 2. We'll get a 3rd, Abigail said. The Whitfields moved to the next county over, didn't they? Somebody should still know where. I know where, Eleanor said. But the Whitfields left angry and ashamed. They might not want their business dug back up. Then we ask gently, Abigail said, and we tell them the truth that speaking up now might be the only way anybody gets their land back or their money back, or at least their name cleared of the shame that was never theirs to carry in the first place. It took 4 days of careful letters and 1 long, uncomfortable ride to the neighboring county before the Whitfields agreed to send copies of their own ruined note, and when it arrived, the pattern was unmistakable. The same compounding error, the same invented payments, the same careful legal language built to confuse rather than clarify. 3 notes. 3 ranches, 1 hand behind all of them. Caleb sat at the kitchen table that night with all 3 notes spread in front of him. Eleanor's and the Whitfields and his own lined up side by side under the lamplight, and looked at them like a man looking at a weapon he hadn't known he was carrying until someone handed it to him fully assembled. This is enough, he said. This is more than enough. It's enough to bring to Reyes, Abigail said. It's not enough to win, not yet. Cutter will fight this. He has money. He has friends on the town council. He has a reputation he spent years building specifically, so people like us won't be believed over people like him. We'll need every piece of evidence airtight, every date checked twice, every signature verified. This is the beginning of the fight, Caleb, not the end of it. You sound like you've done this before. I haven't, she admitted. But I've been on the losing end of a fight like this once already, and I paid close enough attention to know exactly what it takes to lose. He looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that she couldn't quite name, and then he reached across the table, not for the notes, but for her hand, the one still faintly scarred from the fence wire, and held it briefly warm and rough and steady. We're not going to lose this one, he said. She didn't pull her hand away. She should have some old cautious part of her whispered, should have remembered that trusting a man's steady hand had cost her everything once before. But this felt different in a way she didn't have words for yet, and she let herself have it, just for that one quiet moment in the lamplight, before she gently drew her hand back and returned to the notes, because there was still work to do, and work she had learned was the only thing that had never once betrayed her. It was 2 nights later that Harlan Cutter made his boldest move yet. He didn't come to the ranch this time. He sent word instead through the same nervous lawyer that he had reason to believe Mrs. Abigail Mercer had, during her time at her previous residence, engaged in what he delicately called financial impropriety regarding her late husband's estate, a claim so baseless, so plainly invented that Abigail's hands shook with rage rather than fear when she read it. He's trying to discredit me before we even reach a judge, she said, pacing the kitchen floor, her voice tight. If he can make people believe I'm not trustworthy, then anything I testify to about his notes becomes suspect too. It's a lie, Caleb said. Anyone who's spent 5 minutes around you would know it's a lie. It doesn't matter if it's a lie. It only matters if enough people repeat it before the truth catches up. That's exactly how he operates. He builds doubt faster than anyone can dismantle it. Then we get ahead of it, Caleb said. We ride to Reyes ourselves, tonight if we have to, before Cutter's lie has time to spread any further than that lawyer's mouth. They rode through this dark that night, notes bundled carefully against the jostling of the horses, Eleanor riding alongside them with a lantern held high, and somewhere in the 3rd hour of riding, exhausted, dust-covered, running on nothing but stubbornness, and the fear of what would happen if they arrived too late. Abigail's horse stumbled on loose rock, and she nearly went down hard before Caleb's hand shot out and caught her arm, steadying her, holding on a beat longer than the moment strictly required. Careful, he said low, and there was something in his voice that wasn't just about the rock in the road. "I'm always careful," she said, breathless, and he almost laughed, the real kind again, brief and warm in the dark. They reached Reyes's office by first light, exhausted and travel-worn, and the lawyer, older than Eleanor's letter, had suggested gray at the temples, sharp-eyed in a way that reminded Abigail uncomfortably of Cutter himself. Though the resemblance ended the moment he opened his mouth, looked over the 3 notes for the better part of an hour without speaking, comparing handwriting, checking dates, muttering numbers under his breath. Finally he looked up. "This is a pattern," he said. "A deliberate one. I've seen men run schemes like this before, though rarely this careful, and rarely against this many victims at once." He looked at Abigail directly. "You compiled this." "I did." "You have a talent for numbers, Mrs. Mercer." "I had a teacher," she said, "who taught me that numbers don't lie even when the men writing them do." Reyes almost smiled at that, the first real warmth he'd shown all morning. "I'll take the case," he said. "But I'll tell you plainly, Cutter has resources, and resources buy delay, and delay favors the man who already holds the land. We'll need more evidence, tighter evidence, and we'll need it before the season's end, before he can call in Decker's note and settle the matter before a judge ever sees it. And Mrs. Mercer," his eyes sharpened, "I understand Cutter's already spreading claims against your character. Be prepared. Men like him don't fight fair, and they don't fight only once." They rode home slower than they'd ridden out, sun climbing high and merciless overhead, the whole valley shimmering with heat and drought, and the long dry wait for rain that refused to come. And somewhere along that road, Tired passed. Speaking, Caleb reached over without a word and took her hand again, and this time she did not let go, and neither of them said anything about it, because some things she was learning didn't need to be said to be understood. They were still a mile from the ranch gate when they saw the smoke. Not the barn this time. The smoke was rising thin and gray from the direction of the north pasture where Caleb kept the last of his summer hay, stacked and drying, and Caleb spurred his horse forward without a word, and Abigail followed, heart hammering, because 2 fires inside of 2 weeks was not an accident by any measure, a reasonable person could believe. And whatever Harlan Cutter had planned next, it was clear now that he had no intention of waiting for a judge to decide anything at all. By the time they reached the pasture, the hired hands had already beaten most of the flames down with wet sacking, and what remained of the stack was black and smoldering rather than fully lost. But Caleb's face, when he surveyed it, had gone the color of ash itself. "Half the winter feed," he said. "Gone or near enough." "Same as before," Abigail said, crouching at the edge of the burn line, studying the ground the way she'd studied his ledger, looking for what didn't add up. "Look here." She pointed to a set of boot prints pressed into the dry dirt at the pasture's edge, distinct from the ranch hand's worn work boots, sharper heeled, the kind a man wore when he wanted to look prosperous rather than practical. Caleb crouched beside her and went very still. "That's not one of mine," he said. "No," she agreed. "And it wasn't lightning, and it wasn't a dropped pipe ash, because there's no char pattern consistent with either. Somebody walked out here, set this fire, and walked back the way he came, without once circling the stack to check his work, which tells me he wasn't a careful man, just a hurried one. You can read that from a boot print. I can read a great many things from very small evidence, Mr. Decker," she said, and there was an edge in her voice now that hadn't been there before, something forged fresh in the ashes of 2 fires in 2 weeks. "It's the only advantage a person like me has ever had against men like Cutter. I notice what they think nobody's looking closely enough to see." Caleb's straightened jaw, working eyes scanning the tree line at the pasture's edge, like he expected to find the man himself still lurking there. "I'm writing for the sheriff," he said. "The sheriff in this county takes his supper at the same table as half of Cutter's business partners," Eleanor said quietly, having caught up on her own tired horse. "He'll write it down as an accident before you finish describing it." "Then we don't need the sheriff to believe us," Abigail said. "We need Reyes to believe us, and a judge after him. Sketch the print before the wind erases it. Note the position, the depth, the direction it faced. Small things build a case when the big things get denied." They worked through the last hour of daylight, documenting what they could. The boot print, the burn pattern, a scrap of dark wool caught on a fence post nearby that hadn't been there the week before. And by the time the sun dropped fully behind the ridge, Abigail's hands were black with soot, and her voice had gone hoarse from coughing. But there was a kind of grim satisfaction in her chest that hadn't been there in months. The satisfaction of a woman who had finally found the shape of the enemy she was fighting, and had stopped being frightened of shadows she couldn't name. That night, after Eleanor had ridden home, and the hands had finally banked down the last smoldering embers, Caleb found Abigail sitting alone on what remained of the porch steps, staring out at the dark line of the ruined pasture, her soot-streaked hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee she hadn't touched. "You should sleep," he said, settling down beside her without being invited close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed hers. "I keep thinking about what happens if we lose," she said. "Not to the fire, to the case. If Reyes can't make it stick, if Cutter's money outlasts our evidence, if a judge somewhere decides paper matters more than truth." Her voice caught, and she hated that it did. Hated the way 6 months of holding herself together threatened to come apart on a dark porch step in front of a man she'd known less than a month. "I've already lost one house to that man. I don't think I can watch him take another." "You won't be watching alone this time," Caleb said. "That's not the same as winning." "No," he agreed, "but it's not nothing either." They sat in silence a while, the cicadas loud in the dark, the smell of smoke still clinging faint to both their clothes, and Abigail became aware slowly of how close he was sitting, of the warmth coming off him, despite the cooling night air of the particular quality of silence between two people who have run out of things to say and are simply choosing deliberately to stay anyway. "Caleb," she said, and something in the way she said his name made him turn his head toward her fully. Whatever might have happened next, and something was clearly about to some shift, neither of them had quite decided to name, was interrupted by the sound of a wagon on the road lantern swinging, and a voice calling out Caleb's name with the particular urgency of bad news traveling fast. It was one of the Ashford boys, breathless, having ridden hard from town. "Miss Delacroix is asking after you. Mr. Decker," he said, and something in Abigail's chest went tight and cold at the name, though she couldn't have said why, until Caleb's face shifted into something guarded and careful. "Her father's saying it's time the two of you set a date, seeing as your note's coming due, and hers is the only family in the valley with money enough to help you clear it clean." The silence that followed was worse than the fire had been. "Who is Miss Delacroix?" Abigail asked, and she kept her voice even professional. The voice she used for reading ledgers, because she could not let either of these men see how much the question cost her. "Nobody," Caleb said too fast. "Sylvie Delacroix," the boy supplied helpfully, oblivious to the tension he'd ridden into. "Banker's daughter from the county seat. Her pa's been saying for a year now that a marriage would fix Decker's note troubles quicker than any lawyer could. That's her father's talk," Caleb said, sharp now, standing up off the step, like the conversation had physically pushed him to his feet. "Not mine. I never asked for it, and I never encouraged it." "You didn't have to answer that," Abigail said, quiet. Standing as well, putting distance between them, without quite meaning to, some old instinct for self-protection taking over before she'd consciously decided to let it. "It's not my business who you marry, Mr. Decker." "Abigail, I have soot on my hands and a case to build," she said, and went inside before he could say whatever else was rising in his throat, because she needed badly to not be standing on that porch when he said it. Whatever it was, because some part of her, some old, wounded, careful part, had already decided that hoping for anything more than a business arrangement with this man was a luxury she couldn't afford twice in one lifetime. She lay awake a long time that night, listening again to the sound of him pacing in the next room, and did not let herself wonder what he was pacing about. The following morning, tension sat thick between them, neither one mentioning the porch or the banker's daughter or the words that hadn't been said, and they worked the ruined pasture in near silence, salvaging what hay could be salvaged until Eleanor arrived at midday, with news that changed the shape of the fight entirely. "Reyes sent word," she said, dismounting, fast paper in hand. "Cutter's gotten wind that we've filed preliminary inquiry. He's moving to call in Decker's note early, not end of season anymore. 2 weeks. He's using the fires as justification, same trick as before, claiming instability on the property makes the debt a risk he can't carry. Caleb went very still. 2 weeks, he repeated. Reyes says it's a stall tactic disguised as caution, Eleanor said. He's hoping to force the sale before the fraud case can be heard. If he gets the land before the judge hears the evidence, the case becomes about a man who no longer owns anything worth fighting for. Abigail felt something cold and clear settle into place behind her ribs. The same feeling she'd had the morning she found the first miscalculated entry. The feeling of a puzzle's true shape finally emerging from underneath its scattered pieces. Then we stop being careful, she said. We stop building this case slow and clean. We take everything we have, Eleanor's note, the Whitfields, Caleb's, the fire evidence, the boot print, and we bring it to Reyes today, not next week, and we ask him what it takes to force a hearing before 2 weeks run out. That fast? Cutter's not waiting for us to be ready, Abigail said. So we don't wait either. Caleb looked at her across the ruined pasture soot, still faint on both their hands. The banker's daughter still unspoken between them, the note now ticking down toward a deadline. Neither of them had chosen, and something settled in his face that looked finally like a man deciding to stop being afraid of how much he had left to lose. Saddle the horses, he said. They rode hard for Reyes's office, the sun climbing white and merciless overhead, and this time there was no room left for softness between them. No lingering touches or half-finished sentences, because the ground beneath both their futures had just shifted from a slow fight into a race against a clock neither of them controlled. Reyes met them at his office door before they'd even dismounted a fresh paper in his hand, his face grimmer than it had been 3 days before. Cutter's lawyer filed this morning, he said, holding it out. Formal notice. He's calling the note due in 2 weeks, citing property instability, same language his man used with you directly. If we don't have a hearing scheduled before that date, he takes the ranch regardless of what the fraud case eventually decides. Can he do that? Caleb asked, jaw tight. Legally, if the note allows it, yes. Morally, no. But morality's never once stopped a man like Cutter, and I doubt it'll start today. Reyes rubbed a hand over his tired eyes. I can request an emergency hearing. Judge Alden's fair mostly, but he's cautious, and cautious judges don't like being rushed. We'll need something undeniable. Something that makes delay look like exactly what it is, a man trying to outrun the truth before it catches him. We have 3 notes, Abigail said. The boot print, the wool scrap. That's suspicion, Reyes said. Strong suspicion, not proof. I need something that ties Cutter directly to the fires or directly to the forged entries, something a judge can hold in his hand and not explain away. Abigail's mind raced back over every line she'd copied, every column she'd checked, twice searching for the one piece she'd overlooked. The bank, she said suddenly. The cattleman's bank in town. If Cutter's writing these notes independent of the bank's actual ledgers, there should be a discrepancy between what the bank shows on record and what Cutter's private notes claim. Banks keep their own copies. If his numbers don't match theirs, that's it, Reyes said, sitting forward. That's exactly it. If the bank's records show one figure and Cutter's private note shows another, that's not a mistake a court can forgive. That's forgery, plain and documented. The bank won't just hand over records to strangers, Caleb said. No, Reyes agreed. But they'll hand them over under court order if I file the right request today. It'll take a day, maybe 2, to get the clerk to pull the originals. He was already reaching for paper, already writing. Go home. Rest if you can stomach it. I'll send word the moment I have something. They rode back slower than they'd ridden out, the 2 weeks now feeling shorter with every mile, and neither of them spoke of Sylvie Delacroix. Though her name sat between them the whole ride home like a stone, neither wanted to be the one to lift. The bank records came back on the 3rd day, delivered by a nervous clerk, who clearly wanted no part of whatever fight his paperwork was about to ignite, and Reyes rode out to the ranch himself, to deliver them, spreading 3 separate documents across the kitchen table, where Eleanor's note and the Whitfield's copy already lay. Here, he said, tapping one line. Bank's own record shows Decker's April payment, correct amount, correct date. Cutter's private ledger, The one Mrs. Mercer's been working from shows a different payment in March, $10 higher. 2 records. Same transaction. 2 different truths. He looked up something fierce now in his tired eyes. This is what wins a case, Mrs. Mercer. Not suspicion. Contradiction. A man can lie about his intentions. He can't lie about 2 pieces of paper that don't agree with each other. Same discrepancy on Eleanor's note, Abigail asked. Same discrepancy. And the Whitfields. 3 for 3. Reyes sat back, exhaling slow. I filed for emergency hearing this morning. Judge Alden granted it. 6 days from now in the county courthouse. Cutter will be there. His lawyers will be there. And you. He looked between Abigail and Caleb. Both of you will need to testify. Mrs. Mercer especially. You found this. You'll need to explain it to a room full of men who are going to look at you and doubt you before you've said a single word. I'm used to being doubted, Abigail said. This will be worse than town gossip, Reyes warned. Cutter's lawyer will attack your character directly. The false claims about your husband's estate, he'll bring them into that courtroom and use them to make the judge question everything else you say. You need to be ready for that. Not just ready to answer it, ready to have it thrown at you in front of every rancher in this valley. Abigail felt her stomach turn cold, but she kept her spine straight. The way she had at the gate the first day, the way she had in the general store, under the weight of whispered judgment. Let him throw it, she said. I've survived worse than a lawyer's insults. I buried my husband and rebuilt a stranger's ranch with these hands. I can survive a courtroom. Caleb looked at her with something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite fear, but sat somewhere heavy in between the look of a man who had started to understand exactly what it might cost the woman beside him to stand up and fight in public for a wrong that belonged in part to both of them. The 6 days that followed passed in a blur of preparation, and on the second of those days, the fight nearly ended before it ever reached the courthouse. Eleanor rode out at dawn, pale and shaking, before Abigail had even finished her coffee. The Whitfields are pulling back, she said, breathless from the ride. I got a letter this morning. They're saying they won't send anyone to testify, won't even let their written statement be read aloud. Somebody visited them 2 nights ago. They wouldn't say who, but I don't need 3 guesses. Cutter, Caleb said flat. They have children, Eleanor said. A new baby not 4 months old. Whatever was said to them, it was enough to make a man who'd already lost everything to Cutter once decide silence was safer than justice. Abigail felt something cold settle in her chest, the same fear that had lived there since her husband's funeral. The fear that money and threat would always outlast truth, that a man like Cutter could simply keep applying pressure until every voice against him went quiet one by one. Without the Whitfield statement, she said slowly, Reyes only has 2 notes, mine and Eleanor's. Is that enough? I don't know, Eleanor admitted. But I know Reyes said 3 would be sufficient. I don't know what 2 does to our chances. They rode to Reyes's office within the hour, and the lawyer took the news with a grim, unsurprised nod, like a man who had watched this exact maneuver played out too many times before to be shocked by it now. It weakens the pattern argument, he said honestly. 2 notes can be argued as coincidence, however unlikely. 3 makes coincidence impossible to claim with a straight face. I won't lie to you, this hurts us. Can we get the Whitfield's original note itself, even without their testimony? Abigail asked. The document exists. It doesn't need to speak. It only needs to be read. Reyes considered this slow. A document without a witness to authenticate it is weaker evidence but not worthless, especially alongside the bank's own records, confirming the same discrepancy pattern. If the bank ledger shows the same kind of error on the Whitfield account as it does on yours and Eleanor's, the document can stand somewhat on its own merit even without the family present to speak to it. Then we go back to the bank, Abigail said. We ask for the Whitfield account records, specifically cross-reference them against the copy they already sent us, and we let the numbers testify since the family can't. It took another full day of writing and waiting, and one uncomfortable conversation with a bank manager, reluctant to release further records without additional court authorization. But by the 4th day, Reyes had secured what he needed, a fresh subpoena, faster this time, the judge apparently willing to move quickly, once he understood the pattern of intimidation forming around the case. "This is good," Reyes said, reviewing the fresh documents late that night by lamplight. Abigail and Caleb both hovering over his shoulder in the cramped little office. This might be better than a nervous family testifying under pressure anyway. Numbers don't get frightened. Numbers don't change their story 2 nights before a hearing. "Small mercy," Caleb muttered. "In this line of work," Reyes said, "you learn to take the mercies you're given and stop asking why they're always so small." Caleb looked at her with something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite fear, but sat somewhere heavy in between the look of a man who had started to understand exactly what it might cost the woman beside him to stand up and fight in public for a wrong that belonged in part to both of them. It was on the 5th of those 6 days that Harlan Cutter made his last attempt to end the fight before it ever reached the courthouse. He came alone this time. No lawyer, no false pleasantries riding up to the gate at dusk, with a look on his face that had finally shed every pretense of civility. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, dismounting slow. "A word, privately." "Anything you say to her, you say in front of me," Caleb said, stepping between them without hesitation. Cutter's mouth curled not quite a smile. "Fine, have it your way." He looked at Abigail, and his voice dropped into something colder, quieter, more dangerous than his earlier charm had ever been. "I know what you found in the bank records. I know what you intend to bring to that courthouse. And I want you to understand something. Before you do, men like Decker have lost land to me before, and they've survived it. Widows like you, though." His eyes narrowed. "A widow with a ruined reputation doesn't survive quite so easily. Nobody hires her. Nobody trusts her near their books. Nobody marries her either if it comes to that. You'd be walking away from this fight into a life with nothing left in it at all. Whereas if you were to simply misplace those bank records, forget what you found, ride on to some other territory where nobody's heard your name yet. You're offering me money to disappear," Abigail said flat. "I'm offering you a future," Cutter said, "which is more than most men would offer a woman built the way you are carrying the history you're carrying." Caleb moved so fast Abigail barely saw it, one hand closing hard around the front of Cutter's coat, hauling him half off his feet, his voice a low, furious growl she'd never heard from him before. "You will not speak to her like that on my land." "Let him go, Caleb," Abigail said, and though her voice shook, it did not break. "He wants you to hit him. A bruise on his jaw would look wonderful in front of Judge Alden, proof that Decker's a violent man who can't control himself when threatened. Don't give him the evidence he's fishing for." Caleb's grip loosened, slow, reluctant, and he released Cutter with something that looked like physical pain at having to do it. Cutter straightened his coat, breathing hard, the mask of civility gone entirely now, replaced by something uglier and more honest. "You'll regret this," he said, looking at Abigail. "Both of you. That courthouse won't save you. Judges believe men with money, not women who read numbers, and men who can't pay their debts." "We'll see," Abigail said, and she said it steady, and something in her steadiness seemed to unsettle him more than any threat could have, because he mounted his horse fast and rode off without another word, dust rising behind him, same as it always did. Caleb stood there a long moment, breathing hard, hands still curled into fists. "I wanted to break his jaw," he admitted. "I know. You stopped me, because I need you standing in that courtroom next to me in 6 days, she said. Not sitting in a jail cell for assault, while Cutter tells the judge I've been keeping company with a violent man. She looked up at him, something fierce and tired and grateful, all tangled together in her face. Thank you. For wanting to, even if I couldn't let you. He reached out, then slow, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His rough fingers gentle in a way that contradicted the fury still simmering in his eyes, and neither of them said anything about what that gesture meant, because there wasn't time. Not with 6 days shrinking toward the hearing, and a man like Cutter still circling the edges of everything they were trying to build. The morning of the hearing arrived hot and dry, the whole valley holding its breath for rain that still hadn't come, and Abigail dressed in her one good dress, the same one she'd been mending the night before her stagecoach ride to the Decker gate, the hem now sewn tight and even no longer torn. The courthouse was packed. Word had spread through the valley, same as it always did, and half the ranchers Cutter had ever loaned money to sat in those wooden benches, some hopeful, some skeptical, all of them watching closely to see whether a widow with a sewing case and a stranger's ledger could actually bring down a man who had held this valley's fear in his pocket for years. Judge Alden was an older man, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, in the particular way of a man who had heard every kind of lie a courtroom could produce and had learned to sift patiently through all of them. "Mr. Reyes," he said, "you may proceed." Reyes laid out the case methodically. The 3 notes. The bank records the discrepancies, calling Eleanor first to testify to her husband's original signing, then the Whitfield's documentation, read into record by proxy, since they hadn't made the ride, and then finally he called Abigail. She stood and felt every eye in that room land on her. At once, felt the old familiar weight of being looked at and measured, and found by half the room's silent assumption already lacking a plus-size widow in a mended dress standing where powerful men usually stood. She did not let it bend her spine. "Mrs. Mercer," Reyes said, "walk the court through what you found." She did slow, clear, precise laying out the compounding interest error, the forged March payment the pattern repeated across 3 separate ranches. Her voice steady, even as her hands clasped in front of her, trembled faintly with the effort of holding herself together in front of so many watching faces. Cutter's lawyer rose for cross-examination with a smile that promised exactly the kind of attack Reyes had warned her about. "Mrs. Mercer," he began, "isn't it true that you yourself lost a home to foreclosure just months ago?" "Yes," she said, refusing to let her voice waver. "And isn't it true that you've made accusations against my client's character out of what might reasonably be called personal grievance, rather than objective fact?" "The bank records aren't personal grievance," Abigail said. "They're bank records. I didn't write them. Your client's private ledger disagreeing with the bank's own copy isn't something I invented out of spite. It's something that already existed before I ever set foot on Decker land. You've also been accused of financial impropriety regarding your late husband's estate." The lawyer pressed exactly as expected, his voice dropping into something meant to sound regretful while landing like a blade. "Isn't it true that questions have been raised about your handling of—" "Those questions were raised by your client," Abigail cut in, and something in her voice made the whole room go still. "2 days after I began finding discrepancies in his ledgers. I invite this court to ask Mr. Cutter to produce any evidence at all supporting that claim from any source that existed before I started reading his handwriting closely enough to recognize it on 3 separate ranches' notes." She turned not to the lawyer now, but toward Cutter himself, sitting rigid at his table. "I think you'll find, Your Honor, that no such evidence exists, because the accusation was never about my husband's estate. It was about silencing a woman who noticed what she wasn't supposed to notice." A murmur ran through the courtroom, and Judge Alden's gavel came down once sharp, though his eyes, when they settled on Abigail, held something that looked almost like respect. "Mr. Cutter's counsel will produce that evidence," the judge said, "or strike the claim from record entirely. Continue, Mrs. Mercer." The lawyer flustered, now shuffled his papers, buying time, and tried a different angle entirely. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Mercer, that you were hired by Mr. Decker under highly irregular circumstances, a woman with no references, no prior employment in ranch management taken in off a single stagecoach arrival?" "That's true," Abigail said plainly. "I had no references because I had no employer before Mr. Decker, having been a wife and a homemaker for 9 years before my husband's death, left me with neither a husband nor a home. I don't believe the court considers grief and widowhood a disqualification from honest work." "But surely you understand how it appears," the lawyer pressed. "A stranger taken in given access to a man's private financial records within days of her arrival. It appears," Abigail said exactly as it was. "A man in trouble and a woman capable of recognizing the shape of the trouble he was in, because I had recently lived through the same shape myself at your client's hand." She let the silence hang a beat before continuing. "If Mr. Decker had hired a man with references and credentials who happened to be blind to fraud, Would this court find that more comforting than a widow who happened to see clearly? I would think a court concerned with truth would care rather more about what was found than about who happened to be the one doing the finding. The lawyer's mouth tightened, and he glanced toward Cutter's table for guidance that didn't come, because Cutter himself had gone very still, watching Abigail now, with something that had curdled from contempt into wary calculation. You've admitted you're not a trained accountant, not a lawyer. What qualifies you to interpret complex interest calculations at all? Arithmetic doesn't require a license, sir, Abigail said. It requires only that a person add correctly and be willing to check their work twice. Mr. Cutter's clerks apparently were unwilling to do either, or perhaps they were entirely willing and simply instructed to add incorrectly in a direction that always happened to favor their employer. Laughter rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by the gavel. But not before Abigail saw something in Cutter's face crack for the first time. Not fear, yet, but the beginning of it. The recognition of a man watching the ground shift beneath feet that had never once had to worry about losing balance. Reyes called Caleb next, and he testified plain and steady about the fires, the boot print, the timing of Cutter's demand for early repayment falling suspiciously close on the heels of the first evidence being gathered. Objection, Cutter's lawyer said. Speculation. Mr. Decker has no proof his property fires were anything but accidental. Sustained, Judge Alden said. Strike the speculation regarding the fire's origin. The physical evidence regarding the notes stands. It was a blow, and Abigail felt it land in her chest, even sitting in the gallery, because the fires had been the clearest proof of how far Cutter was willing to go. And now that proof sat outside the boundaries of what the court would consider. But Reyes, unshaken, moved forward with what remained 3 notes, 3 discrepancies, one hand behind all of them, undeniable now in black ink on bank paper, that Cutter himself could not explain away. The judge called a recess to review the documentation, and the courtroom emptied into the hot midday sun, ranchers clustering in small groups, murmuring, watching Cutter's table, where he sat rigid and alone, his lawyer whispering urgently beside him. Eleanor found Abigail outside, gripping her hands tight. "You did it," she whispered. "You stood up there in front of the whole valley, and you did it. We haven't won yet," Abigail said, though her heart was pounding hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. "You've already won something," Eleanor said. "Whatever the judge decides, you made that room see you as more than what they expected to see. That's not nothing, Abigail. That's not nothing at all." Caleb found her a moment later, standing a little apart from the crowd, and he didn't say anything at first, just looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the look of a man recalibrating again and again everything he'd assumed about what a woman like her was capable of. "You were magnificent in there," he said, finally quiet just for her. "I was terrified in there. Didn't look it, not once. That's because I've had a great deal of practice not letting terror show on my face," she said, and something in the honesty of that admission made him step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him despite the noon heat. "Abigail," he said low, and there was something in the way he said it that told her whatever had been interrupted on the porch step, whatever had gotten swallowed by news of Sylvie Delacroix, was about to surface again, right there in the dusty square outside the county courthouse. "There's something I need you to know," he continued, "before that judge comes back with whatever he's decided, whatever happens with the ranch, whatever happens with Cutter. I need you to know that Sylvie Delacroix was never a choice I was making. Her father's talk, not mine. I should have said it plainer that night on the porch instead of letting you walk away thinking otherwise. You don't owe me an explanation about who you marry Caleb. I think I do," he said, "because I've spent every day since you climbed down off that stagecoach discovering exactly how wrong I was about you at that gate, and I'll be damned if I let a banker's daughter and her father's ambitions stand between us because I was too proud or too slow to say so out loud." Before Abigail could find words for the storm rising in her chest, the courthouse bell rang, calling everyone back inside, and the moment folded itself away unfinished, tucked beneath the weight of the verdict still waiting to be delivered. They filed back into their seats, and Judge Alden took his place at the bench with the same unhurried gravity he'd carried through the whole proceeding, papers stacked neatly in front of him, his expression giving nothing away. I have reviewed the bank's original records against the notes presented by Mr. Reyes on behalf of the plaintiffs, he said. The discrepancies are consistent, deliberate, and in my judgment, constitute clear evidence of fraudulent alteration across all three notes in question. A ripple went through the gallery, quickly silenced. However, the judge continued, and the single word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Fraud of this nature, spanning multiple victims over multiple years, is beyond the scope of what this court can resolve in a single emergency hearing. I am referring this matter to Territorial Court for full prosecution, which will take considerably longer to conclude than any of you standing in this room today would prefer. Abigail's stomach dropped. Caleb's hand found hers under the bench, gripping tight. In the interim, Judge Alden went on, given the clear evidence of fraudulent alteration to Mr. Decker's note, specifically, I am ordering an immediate injunction preventing Mr. Cutter from calling that note due or taking any action against the Decker property until Territorial Court has rendered final judgment on the underlying fraud. The room erupted, not in cheering. Exactly, this was not a room built for celebration, but in a low, rising murmur of disbelief and relief tangled together. Ranchers turning to each other with expressions that hadn't dared hope this far. Cutter sat frozen at his table, his face gone the color of old paper, his lawyer already gathering documents with the particular haste of a man calculating how much worse this was about to get before it got better. Caleb turned to Abigail, breathless, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all, the noise of the courtroom fading around them into something distant and unimportant. "The ranch is safe," he said, like he was testing the words for the first time, unsure they could possibly be true. "For now," Abigail said. "Until Territorial Court rules. But it's safe today. That's more than we had this morning." "You did this," Caleb said. "You standing in front of that whole room, refusing to let him shrink you down to nothing." "We did this," she corrected. "All of us. Eleanor, Reyes, you standing beside me when it would have been easier to stand alone." They had barely stepped out into the hot afternoon sun when a young woman in a fine traveling dress pushed through the dispersing crowd toward them, cheeks flushed, clearly having heard the verdict from someone already outside. "Caleb," she said, breathless, and Abigail felt her whole body go still at the familiarity in the woman's voice, at the easy way she said his name, the way only someone with history behind her would say it. "Sylvie," Caleb said, and there was no warmth in it, only a kind of tired wariness. "What are you doing here?" "My father heard about the hearing. He sent me to see how it went, since your note affects the bank's interests, same as anyone's." Her eyes flicked to Abigail, sharp and assessing, in a way that made no attempt to hide its judgment. "And this must be the housekeeper everyone's been talking about." "Mrs. Mercer," Abigail said, holding out her hand, refusing to be spoken about, as though she weren't standing directly in front of the woman speaking. Sylvie's handshake was brief, cool, dismissive. "My father says you've caused quite a stir in the valley, Mrs. Mercer, reading men's private ledgers, testifying in courtrooms. Unusual work for a woman in your position." "Fraud doesn't care what position a woman holds when she finds it," Abigail said evenly. "It only cares whether she's willing to say so out loud." Sylvie's smile went thin, and she turned back to Caleb with the particular focus of a woman accustomed to getting what she'd come for. "Father still hopes we might discuss the arrangement he proposed. Now that your note trouble seems resolved, there's no reason to let the conversation lapse entirely." "There's every reason," Caleb said flat. "I told your father the same thing I'll tell you now, Sylvie. There was never an arrangement. There was only your father's ambition and my silence, which I should have corrected a long time ago, instead of letting it linger unspoken." He glanced at Abigail, brief but unmistakable, before looking back to Sylvie. "I'm not available for arrangements. Not with your father's bank, and not with you." Sylvie's composure cracked for just a moment, something raw and stung flashing across her face before she smoothed it back into practiced indifference. "You'll regret choosing pride over security, Caleb Decker," she said, and turned on her heel, disappearing back into the crowd without another word. Abigail stood very still, heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with the courtroom she'd just survived. You didn't have to say that, she said quietly. Not there. Not like that. I've been meaning to say it for weeks, Caleb said. I was only waiting for the right moment, and I've learned lately that the right moment doesn't announce itself politely. Sometimes you just have to take it before it disappears. Outside the courthouse, as the crowd dispersed into the hot afternoon, Harlan Cutter mounted his horse alone, his lawyer having already fled toward his own transportation without a backward glance. And before he rode off, he turned once, finding Abigail's eyes across the dusty square. There was no charm left in his expression now, no pretense of civility, only a cold, calculating fury that promised without a single word spoken that this was not the end of the fight, only the end of the first round of it, and that a man who had spent years building a fortune off other people's fear was not going to let one widow and one stubborn rancher take it apart in a single afternoon without finding some new angle to strike from. He rode off, and Abigail watched him go and felt underneath the relief and the exhaustion and the strange, giddy disbelief of having survived a courtroom she'd walked into terrified. A cold certainty settled into her bones that the territorial court ruling was still months away, and that months were more than enough time for a desperate man to find one more way to burn down everything they'd built. That evening, riding home in a wagon crowded with Eleanor's quiet joy and Reyes's careful satisfaction, and Caleb's hand finding hers again, without hesitation this time, without interruption, Abigail allowed herself for the first time since the stagecoach had dropped her at that gate to imagine a future that didn't end in loss. It frightened her more than the courtroom had. But she did not let go of his hand. The weeks that followed the hearing settled into something Abigail hadn't let herself hope for in longer than she could remember, a rhythm. Mornings spent hauling water for stock that grew thirstier by the day as the drought tightened its grip on the valley. Afternoons spent finishing what the fires had started to undo. Evenings spent at the kitchen table with Caleb across from her. The ledger between them, now more habit than necessity, since the numbers had long since been set right. And there was little left to fix, except the quiet act of sitting together while the lamp burned low. But the drought was not a rhythm that forgave anyone for settling into comfort. By the third week of August, the creek that ran along the eastern fence line had shrunk to a trickle, and Caleb walked its bed each morning with a face carved tighter than the cracked earth beneath his boots. "We lose the creek entirely," he said one evening. "We're hauling every drop from the well, and the well's already down further than I've ever seen it." "How much stock can the well support alone?" Abigail asked. "Half what I'm running now. Maybe less if this heat holds through September." "Then we sell before we're forced to," she said. "Better to sell healthy cattle at a fair price now than watch them go thin and worthless waiting for rain that isn't coming." Caleb looked at her like the suggestion cost him something physical to hear. "That herd took me 6 years to build." "I know," she said gently. "But a herd you can rebuild. A ranch you've lost to drought and debt both you can't." He was quiet a long moment, jaw working, and then he nodded slow, the nod of a man conceding, not because he'd been beaten in an argument, but because he'd finally let someone else's clear sight matter more than his own pride. "You'll help me work the numbers on what to sell first." "Always," she said, and meant it in a way that went further than ledgers. They drove 11 head to the stockyard in town 2 days later, and the sale went well enough to buy them another month's margin against the drought. But the trip cost them something else entirely, because standing at the stockyard gate counting coin into Caleb's palm was a buyer who worked, as it turned out, for none other than Harlan Cutter's cattle brokerage. "Small world," the buyer said, counting out the last of the coin with a smile that held too much knowledge behind it. "Mr. Cutter mentioned he expected you might be along soon enough selling off stock. Said the drought would do what the courthouse couldn't." Caleb's hand closed hard around the coin. "You tell your employer the courthouse isn't finished with him yet." "I tell him whatever he asks me to relay," the buyer said, unbothered, mounting back onto his wagon. Though for what it's worth, Mr. Decker word around the territorial office is that fraud cases this size take the better part of a year to fully resolve. That's a long time for a man to hold a ranch together on a dying well and a stubborn conscience. He rode off, and Caleb stood there with the coin still fisted tight in his hand, and Abigail watched something old and tired settle back into his shoulders, The weight he'd started to shed over the past month creeping back in at the reminder that Cutter, even cornered, was still circling. "He's right," Caleb said quietly on the ride home. "A year is a long time." "A year is survivable," Abigail said. "We've survived worse in less time than that." "Have we?" he said. And there was something raw in the question, something that wasn't really about the ranch at all. She reached over and took his hand on the wagon bench, same as he'd done for her that night riding to Reyes's office, and he let out a breath like he'd been holding it since the stockyard gate. "We have," she said. "We're still here. That counts for something." It was 2 nights later that the well went dry entirely. Not slow, not gradual, but overnight the bucket coming up with nothing but mud and grit where clear water should have been. And Caleb stood at the wellhead in the gray pre-dawn light with an expression Abigail had never seen on him before, something close to despair. "This isn't drought," he said. "Not alone. Wells this deep don't just quit overnight in a dry season. Somebody's diverted the underground flow, or poisoned the source, or done something to hurry along what the sky was already threatening." "Cutter," Abigail said. "I can't prove it." "You don't need to prove it to know it," she said. "But we need water today, not proof today. What's the nearest source? Pruitt Land has a spring that's held through worse droughts than this. Eleanor won't refuse us." They hauled water from the Pruitt Spring for 6 straight days, wagon after wagon, backs aching. Hands blistered fresh over blisters, only just healed. And on the 4th of those days, one of the hired hands quit, outright packing his few belongings onto a borrowed horse with an apology that sounded more frightened than regretful. Man came through town saying anyone still working Decker land was working for a lost cause. He admitted not meeting Caleb's eyes. Said Cutter's patience was running thinner than the well. "I got a family to think of, Mr. Decker. I'm sorry." Caleb didn't argue. He simply nodded, paid the man what was owed, and watched him ride off, and Abigail saw in the tightness of his jaw exactly how much that quiet acceptance cost him. "We're down to 2 hands, he said that night. "Might be down to 1 by week's end if Cutter keeps working the town like this." "Then it's you and me, and whoever's left," Abigail said. "We've managed worse odds." He looked at her across the kitchen table, lamp burning low, and something in his face shifted into an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not exhaustion, exactly, though there was plenty of that, but something closer to wonder, like a man discovering slow and disbelieving that the thing standing between him and complete ruin was not luck or money or even land, but a woman who refused to let either of them stop fighting. "I don't know how to thank you for staying through this," he said. "A wiser woman would have taken her share of the stockyard money and ridden on to somewhere with a working well and no Cutter circling the fence line. I'm not interested in being wise if it means being alone." Abigail said quieter than she meant to, the words slipping out before she'd fully decided to let them. "I tried alone. I know exactly what it feels like. I'd rather be tired and thirsty here than safe and empty somewhere else." Caleb reached across the table and took her hand, slow, deliberate, and this time neither of them pulled away, and the silence between them stretched long and warm and entirely unafraid. It was Eleanor who found the truth about the well. 8 days later, arriving breathless with news that finally gave shape to the shapeless fear both of them had been carrying. "One of my hands overheard talk in town," she said. "A man bragging in the saloon about being paid well for quiet work out at the Decker property line said something about diverting flow through an old mining channel nobody remembered still existed. Said his employer wanted the well dry before the drought could take the blame for it fair and square." "Did he say who employed him?" Caleb asked, already moving for his horse. "He didn't need to," Eleanor said. "Everyone in that saloon already knew." "That's evidence," Abigail said, catching Caleb's arm before he could mount up in fury. "Real evidence this time of sabotage tied directly to Cutter. We take it to Reyes. We don't ride out to confront a drunk man in a saloon and hand Cutter another excuse to paint you violent." Caleb's jaw worked fury and reason warring plainly across his face, and after a long moment, reason won the way it had started winning more often since Abigail's arrival, and he exhaled hard and nodded. "Reyes, then," he said. "Tonight." Reyes took the news with the same grim satisfaction he'd shown at every previous discovery, scribbling notes fast, already calculating how the evidence might strengthen the pending territorial case. "Sabotage of a water source is a serious charge," he said. "If we can get that hand to testify formally sober and under oath, this becomes more than a financial fraud case. This becomes a pattern of ongoing criminal intimidation, which territorial court will weigh far more heavily than paperwork discrepancies alone." "Will he testify?" Abigail asked. "A drunk man bragging in a saloon isn't the same as a man willing to put his name on a sworn statement. That," Reyes admitted, "is the part I can't promise you. Men who take money for quiet work rarely want their names attached to what that work actually was." It took another week of careful, patient persuasion. Eleanor's gentle insistence, Reyes's legal reassurance that testimony against Cutter would be protected, and finally, the hand's own guilt worn thin by watching the Decker cattle grow gaunt on rationed water he himself had helped steal, before the man agreed to give a sworn statement. Hands shaking as he signed it, admitting to the diversion, admitting who had paid him, admitting in careful, reluctant detail that Harlan Cutter had specifically instructed him to make the sabotage look indistinguishable from natural drought. That signature was, Reyes told them plainly, likely to be the single most damaging piece of evidence in the entire case. "This isn't fraud anymore," he said. "This is criminal conspiracy. Territorial court will not look kindly on a man willing to poison a well to win a financial dispute. I expect Cutter's lawyers to begin discussing settlement terms rather than risk a trial once they learn what we're holding." But Cutter did not go quiet simply because the evidence had turned against him. 3 days after the sworn statement was filed, the witness himself rode out to the Decker ranch at dusk, hat in hand, face pale beneath a fresh bruise along his jaw. "I need to withdraw my statement," he said, not meeting anyone's eyes. "Man came to my house last night. Didn't give a name. Didn't need to. Told me accidents happen to families who talk too much to lawyers." Caleb's hands curled into fists. "He threatened your family." "Didn't say it plain. Said it plain enough." Abigail stepped forward before Caleb's fury could take over the conversation entirely. "Reyes told you your testimony would be protected. Have you told him about this threat?" "Didn't think it'd matter. A signature's a signature. I can just say I misremembered." "A threatened witness recanting under pressure is itself evidence," Abigail said. "Reyes can petition the court for protection, can have the threat itself investigated as further proof of Cutter's methods. Withdrawing your statement doesn't make you safer. It only makes Cutter bolder, and it leaves you carrying the guilt of a well gone dry with no consequence attached to the man who did it." The hand stood silent a long moment, working his hat brim between nervous fingers. "They'll come back," he said, finally quiet. "Whoever it was." "Then let Reyes make sure the law comes for them first," Caleb said. "You did something brave signing that statement. Don't let one bruise undo it." It took the better part of that evening, Reyes summoned out by urgent rider, before the man agreed to let his statement stand, provided Reyes could secure some manner of protection for his family until the case concluded, a request Reyes promised to press before the territorial prosecutor with everything he had given. How directly the intimidation itself now supported the very conspiracy charge they were building. "This is what desperate looks like," Reyes said, once the witness had ridden off under escort of one of Eleanor's hands. "Cutter's out of clever moves. All he has left is fear, and fear only works until somebody decides they'd rather be brave than safe." It was during the same exhausting stretch hauling water, still hands split and healing and splitting again, that Caleb collapsed at the well. One scorching afternoon, felled by heat and exhaustion he'd refused to admit to for days, and Abigail's whole world narrowed down to nothing but the sight of him crumpled in the dust, unmoving. "Caleb," she said. And then, when he didn't stir louder, edged with a fear sharper than anything Cutter had managed to provoke in her all summer. "Caleb." She got him into the shade of the porch, soaked cloths against his neck and wrists, forced water past his lips, a slow trickle at a time, and sat with his head in her lap for the better part of an hour before his eyes finally fluttered open, dazed and apologetic. "How long?" he rasped. "Long enough to frighten 10 years off my life." Abigail said, her voice cracking despite her best effort to keep it steady. You've been hauling water from before dawn every single day and eating half what a man your size needs to keep going. You are no use to this ranch collapsed in the dirt, Caleb Decker. Didn't think it'd catch up with me that fast. It caught up with you because you've been trying to carry this whole drought on your own back, same as you tried to carry the debt before I ever arrived, she said. You don't have to prove anything to me by working yourself into the ground. I'm not going anywhere. You can rest without losing me in the process. He looked up at her, still weak, still pale beneath the sunburn, and something in his face cracked open in a way she hadn't seen from him, even in the worst of the fires. Nobody's said that to me in 6 years, he admitted. Not since my wife passed. I got so used to nobody watching whether I ran myself into the ground that I forgot what it felt like to have someone actually mind. I mind, Abigail said simply, and pressed a cool cloth back against his forehead, and he closed his eyes and let her tend him without another word of protest, which told her, more than any speech could have, exactly how far his walls had finally come down. He recovered within 2 days, stubborn as ever, but chastened enough to accept a lighter share of the hauling, and it was during that recovery that the town's opinion of Abigail began slowly, and without fanfare, to shift. It started small. A woman from the general store, one of the very same who had murmured about curses months before, rode out unannounced with a basket of preserves, mumbling something about neighborly duty during hard times, unable quite to meet Abigail's eyes, but staying long enough to ask haltingly how the sabotage investigation was proceeding, and whether it was true that a widow had been the one clever enough to catch Cutter's fraud in the first place. It's true, Abigail said, and did not let the moment feel like triumph, though some small tired part of her wanted to. My husband took a note from that man 2 years back, the woman admitted, quieter now. I always wondered why the numbers never sat right with me, never had the courage to ask anyone to check them. You still can, Abigail said gently. It's not too late to look closely at what you signed. The woman left with less judgment in her posture than she'd arrived with, and word of the exchange spread through town, same as every other piece of gossip always had. Except this time, it carried something closer to respect than ridicule. And by the following week, 2 more families had quietly approached Eleanor, asking whether Mrs. Mercer might look over their own notes just to be certain. Even the clerk, who had once looked her over with open judgment at the general store counter, nodded to her now when she came in for supplies. A small thing, barely a gesture at all. But Abigail had learned enough about small things this summer to know they were rarely as small as they first appeared. A nod was not an apology. It was not friendship. But it was a door left open, where before there had only been a wall, and she walked through it the same way she walked through every other door this valley had grudgingly opened to her, with her spine straight and her gratitude quiet. The rain, when it finally came, arrived without warning on a Tuesday evening in early September, the sky splitting open after 2 months of dust and prayer, and Abigail stood on the half-rebuilt porch, watching it fall in genuine disbelief, letting it soak through her dress. Laughing for the first time in longer than she could remember. A sound that surprised even her with how unguarded it came out. Caleb came out to stand beside her, both of them getting drenched, neither one caring, and he looked at her laughing in the rain, with an expression that had finally shed every last trace of the suspicion he'd greeted her with at the gate all those weeks ago. You look happy, he said, like it was a discovery. I am happy, she said, and the admission surprised her as much as the laughter had. I didn't think I'd feel that again, not after everything. Neither did I, Caleb said quietly, and reached out, slow, careful, and brushed a strand of wet hair back from her face, his hand lingering against her cheek longer than the gesture required. Caleb, she said, his name coming out softer than she intended. I've been wanting to do something for weeks now, he said, and I keep letting the ranch, the drought cutter, all of it get in the way of saying it plain. So I'm saying it now, rain or no rain. I don't want you gone when this ranch is finally safe, Abigail. I don't want you here because you've got nowhere else to go. I want you here because I've come to need you the way I need rain after 2 dry months, and I didn't know a person could feel that way about somebody twice in one lifetime, not after I buried my own wife 6 years back and told myself that part of my life was finished. Abigail's breath caught rain running down both their faces, and for a moment she simply stood there, letting the weight of what he'd said settle into her chest, alongside everything else this ranch had rebuilt in her over the past 2 months. "I didn't know you'd lost a wife," she said quietly. "Fever," he said. "Same as your husband from what you've told me. I stopped talking about her because talking about her felt like admitting the ranch had beaten me twice, once when she died, and once every day after trying to hold this place together alone." He looked at her, rain dripping from his hat brim. "I don't feel alone anymore, Abigail. Not since you climbed down off that stagecoach with $11 and more courage than any woman I've ever met." She reached up then and kissed him, rain-soaked and unhesitating, and he kissed her back like a man who had spent 6 years convinced he'd never allow himself this again. And when they finally broke apart, breathless, both of them laughing now, soaked through and unbothered by it, Abigail felt something settle inside her chest that she hadn't felt since long before her husband's fever took him, the quiet, solid certainty of being exactly where she belonged. The rain broke the drought for good over the following days, refilling the creek, easing the pressure on the well, even before Reyes's investigator confirmed the sabotaged channel and had it properly repaired. And with the physical crisis lifted, the ranch itself seemed to exhale, fences holding cattle, regaining their weight. The whole valley breathing easier under skies that finally remembered how to deliver what they'd promised all summer. But it was the following week, in a quiet moment neither of them expected, that the deepest proof of how far they'd both come arrived, not through grand gesture, but through something small enough that Abigail almost missed its significance entirely. She came into the kitchen one evening to find the wobbly chair she'd fixed weeks ago, the one Caleb always used to avoid because of its bad leg, sitting untouched at its place at the table, and Caleb sitting instead in the chair beside it, leaving hers, the mended one, empty and waiting. "You could sit there," she said, nodding at the fixed chair. "I know," he said. "I wanted you to have it. You fixed it. Feels right that it's yours." It was such a small thing. A chair. A leg mended with new wood and careful joinery weeks ago during her first days on the ranch, back when she was still proving herself. Still counting down 30 days, like a sentence, rather than a beginning. And yet, something about him saving it for her quietly, without announcement, without expecting thanks, told her more plainly than any rain-soaked kiss ever could, that this man had built a place for her in his life. The same careful way she'd built a place for herself in his ledgers. Slowly, deliberately, one small correction at a time, until what had once been broken simply worked. Eleanor came by 2 days later with news that closed the last open wound of the summer. Word from Reyes that Cutter's lawyers had, exactly as predicted, opened settlement discussions rather than risk the sworn testimony about the well going before a territorial jury. "He's offering full forgiveness of the remaining note balance," Eleanor read from the letter, "in exchange for the case being dropped and all parties agreeing not to pursue further criminal charges regarding the fires and the well." "That's not justice," Caleb said. "That's a man buying his way out of consequences, same as he's always done. It's also your ranch clear and free of debt without another year of court dragging both of you through it," Reyes said, having ridden out himself to deliver the news plainly. "I'll let the decision sit with you both. I can push for full prosecution if that's what you want, and I believe we'd likely win it, given the strength of what we're holding. But it would take months, possibly longer, and it would mean reliving all of this in a courtroom that isn't guaranteed to be any kinder than the last one." Abigail thought of Cutter's face outside the courthouse, cold and promising more fight to come, and thought too of the well gone dry, the fires, the boot prints, the months of fear stacked one on top of another since she'd first climbed down off that stagecoach. "What happens to the other ranchers he's cheated?" she asked. "If we accept a private settlement that only clears Caleb's debt." "Eleanor's note and the Whitfield's claim aren't part of this settlement offer," Reyes clarified. "This is specific to the Decker property. If you accept the criminal case regarding the well sabotage, could still proceed separately, since that charge doesn't belong to Decker alone. It belongs to the territory for the crime of poisoning a shared water source. Cutter can buy his way out of Decker's civil claim. He cannot buy his way out of a criminal charge that the territorial prosecutor chooses to pursue independently." "Then let him settle the debt," Abigail said slowly. and let the territory handle the rest. We get what we actually need, the ranch clear and safe, and we don't have to spend another year of our lives fighting a war that was never fully ours to finish alone." Caleb looked at her a long moment, something unreadable working behind his eyes, and then he nodded, slow, trusting her judgment, the way he'd learned to trust it on every ledger line and every fence repair since the day she arrived. "Draw up the settlement," he told Reyes. "Clear the note. Let the territory handle whatever's left of Cutter's reckoning." Cutter came to the ranch one final time 3 days after the settlement papers were signed, riding up to the gate alone in the fading afternoon light. His fine black coat, looking for the first time since Abigail had known him, faded and out of place against the mended fences and the rebuilt barn behind him. "Come to admire your handiwork?" Caleb asked, stepping out onto the porch, Abigail close behind him. "Come to remind you both that this isn't over," Cutter said, though something in his voice had lost its earlier certainty, worn thin by weeks of losing ground he'd never once expected to lose. "The territorial prosecutors circling. My lawyers say I might lose more than money before this settles fully." "You might," Abigail said. "Fraud and sabotage tend to cost a man more than the widows and ranchers he cheated ever could have taken from him honestly." Cutter's eyes settled on her, and for a moment the old contempt flickered there, but underneath it now sat something raw, something closer to fear than she'd ever seen from him. "You could have taken the money," he said. "Back at the start, disappeared. Lived comfortable somewhere nobody knew your name." "I could have," Abigail agreed. "But comfortable was never worth as much to me as the truth. You built your whole fortune on believing widows and ranchers would always choose comfortable over costly. You were wrong about me. You were wrong about all of us." He said nothing to that jaw working, and after a long moment he turned his horse and rode off without another word. And this time, Abigail felt no cold certainty of further fights to come. Only a tired, settled peace, the particular quiet of a war finally truly ending. That evening, with the note finally truly cleared and the ranch standing solid under a sky washed clean by rain, Caleb and Abigail sat together on the porch steps, the same steps where the fire's grief had once nearly broken her, the same steps where the topic of Sylvie Delacroix had once driven her inside in silence, and for the first time since her stagecoach had rattled to a stop at that gate, Abigail let herself imagine a version of the future that didn't require bracing for the next loss. Eleanor rode out one last time before the season fully turned, bringing not urgent news this time, but simple company sitting with them on the mended porch as the evening cooled around all three of them. "I never thought I'd see this valley change the way it has this summer," she said, watching the fireflies rise over the pasture that had nearly burned twice. Cutter's grip on this place felt permanent, felt like something none of us would ever climb out from under. "It wasn't permanent," Abigail said. "It only felt that way because nobody had looked closely enough to see the cracks in it yet." "You looked," Eleanor said. "I'm grateful every day you climbed down off that coach and decided to keep looking, even when it would have been easier not to." "I had help," Abigail said, glancing at Caleb, who ducked his head unused still to being thanked so plainly. "I had you telling me I wasn't foolish for having trusted the wrong man once. That mattered more than you probably realize." Eleanor left before full dark, and the porch settled back into quiet. The two of them alone again with the fireflies and the cooling night air, and it was into that quiet that Caleb finally spoke the question that had been sitting unasked beneath every kind word and every careful touch since the rain had broken the drought. "You never did tell me," Caleb said quiet in the dark, "whether you can actually sew." Abigail laughed, surprised the sound warm and unguarded. "You asked me that the very first day, before you even knew my name." "I remember," he said. "I also remember you telling me you could fix what's breaking instead of answering the question I actually asked." "I can sew," she said. "Quite well, in fact. My mother taught me before she passed, but I think you already knew the answer didn't matter half as much as whether I'd stay long enough to prove it." "No," Caleb admitted, taking her hand in the dark, his thumb tracing slow over her knuckles, over the scars the fence wire had left there weeks ago, now faded to thin white lines. "It never did matter. I just didn't know yet what I was really asking." They sat together, as the night settled fully over the valley crickets, loud in the wet grass, the smell of rain still clinging to everything. The ranch behind them standing whole and mended, in every place that had once been broken fences, tight barn rebuilt, ledger balanced well running, clear again. And Abigail thought, watching the stars emerge one by one overhead, that she had come to this place with nothing but $11 and a torn hem, expecting only 30 days of trial before being sent away, and had found instead something she'd stopped believing was possible to find twice in one lifetime. Caleb turned to her in the dark, his voice low and steady, carrying none of the guardedness that had marked every word he'd spoken to her at that gate 2 months before. "Abigail," he said, and this time when he said her name, it wasn't a test or a warning or even a question. It was simply the truth of something he'd finally let himself claim out loud. Neither of them moved to fill the silence that followed, because some silences didn't need filling. They only needed to be sat inside of until both people understood exactly what had been said without further words required. It was 3 days later, in the gray hour just after dawn, that a rider came through the gate at a pace that pulled both of them out onto the porch before he'd even reined in fully. "Message from Reyes," the rider said, breathless, holding out a sealed letter. "Said it couldn't wait for regular post." Caleb broke the seal with hands that weren't quite steady, and Abigail read over his shoulder, her own breath catching at the words laid out plain on the page. "Territorial prosecutor has secured formal indictment against Harlan Cutter on charges of fraud forgery and criminal conspiracy related to the sabotage of a shared water source. Warrant issued this morning. Cutter attempted to flee toward the territorial line before dawn. Apprehended 11 miles east of town. Trial date to be set within the month. Come to town when you're able. This valley owes you both more than it will ever properly say." "He's caught," Caleb said, like he needed to hear the words in his own voice before he could believe them. "He tried to run, and they caught him." "It's over," Abigail said, and felt the words settle through her, like the first rain after drought. Slow at first, then all at once, filling every dry waiting place inside her that had spent 6 months bracing for one more loss. They rode to town together that same morning and found the square already buzzing with the news ranchers gathered in small, disbelieving knots. The same women who had once murmured about curses, now standing in the open, unashamed, talking in voices pitched loud enough to be heard. "Caught him running like a coward," one man was saying. "After everything he did to good families in this valley." Eleanor found them at the edge of the crowd, her face bright in a way Abigail hadn't seen since before her husband's death, years of quiet grief finally cracking open into something like joy. "They say the well sabotage charge alone could mean years," Eleanor said, gripping both their hands at once. "Years, Abigail. Not a settlement. Not a fine he can pay his way out of. Actual consequence. Reyes said the fraud case alone might have taken a year to resolve," Abigail said. "This came faster than any of us expected." "Desperate men make desperate mistakes," Caleb said. Running toward the territorial line practically confessed for him. Word spread through the crowd that Judge Alden himself had insisted on presiding over the criminal proceedings personally, having, in his own words to a reporter from the territorial paper, developed a particular interest in seeing this matter through to its proper conclusion. A sentence that made Abigail smile despite herself, remembering the sharp, careful way he'd watched her testify months before, weighing her words like a man determined to be fair, even when fairness was inconvenient. They stayed in town longer than either of them planned, accepting congratulations from ranchers who had once eyed Abigail with suspicion, and now approached her directly asking after her opinion on this note or that debt, treating her for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach as someone whose judgment carried weight in this valley, rather than someone whose body and circumstance made her judgment suspect. It was near midday, standing outside the general store with Caleb fetching supplies inside, that Sylvie Delacroix approached her one final time, dressed sharp as ever, though something in her posture had lost its earlier certainty. "I heard the news," Sylvie said without preamble. "Cutter caught trying to run." "You heard correctly. My father's bank held several of Cutter's other notes as collateral," Sylvie continued, and there was something almost vulnerable beneath her usual composure now. "This scandal touches closer to our family's business than I think you realize. Father's been quieter than I've ever known him to be. "I'm sorry to hear that," Abigail said, and meant it, because she had learned enough this summer about the particular grief of watching one's foundation crumble to feel genuine sympathy, even for a woman who had once looked at her with open contempt. Sylvie studied her a long moment. "I came here today intending to say something cutting. I find I don't have it in me anymore." She hesitated, then added quieter, "You were right outside the courthouse. Fraud doesn't care about position. I think perhaps I've spent too long caring about it instead." She left without waiting for a response, and Abigail stood there a moment surprised at the strange, unlooked-for piece that small exchange had left behind, one more piece of the summer's wreckage, settling quietly into place. Caleb emerged from the store a few minutes later, arms full of supplies, and found her standing thoughtful in the street. "Everything all right?" "Everything settling," Abigail said. "In ways I didn't expect." They rode home in the golden light of early afternoon, the valley around them green again, after the rain, the fences holding the cattle grazing fat on grass, no longer the color of old paper. And Abigail felt for the first time since her husband's fever took him, that the ground beneath her feet had stopped shifting entirely. It was that evening, 3 weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday that carried no particular weight, until Caleb made it carry one, that everything changed again this time, not through crisis, but through a decision he'd clearly been building toward, with the same careful patience he brought to every fence post and every ledger line. He found her in the kitchen working through the last of the harvest accounts by lamplight, and instead of settling into his usual chair across from her, he came around the table and knelt beside her, which startled her enough that she set down her pencil entirely. "Caleb, what?" "I've been practicing this for 2 days," he admitted, "and every version I rehearsed sounded better in my head than it does now that you're actually looking at me." "Then say it plain," she said, her heart already climbing into her throat, some part of her already understanding what was coming even before the words arrived. "You've never needed fine phrases with me before, Abigail Mercer," he said, and took her hand in both of his, rough and steady and warm. "I asked you once if you could sew, and you told me you could fix what's breaking, and I thought at the time you meant the porch, or the fence, or the ledger. I didn't understand yet that you meant something a great deal larger than any of that. You fixed this ranch. You fixed a case nobody else believed could be won. And somewhere in all of that fixing, you fixed something in me I didn't know had gone as broken as it had after my wife passed. And I told myself I'd spend the rest of my life alone, rather than risk that kind of loss again." His voice caught, and he pressed forward anyway the way she'd watched him press forward through fires and droughts and courtroom cross-examinations all summer long. "I don't want 30 days with you anymore," he said. "I don't want a season or a year or however long it takes territorial court to fully settle Cutter's fate. I want all of it, Abigail. Every ordinary evening at this table, every fence that needs mending, every hard morning and every easy one. I'm asking you to marry me not because the ranch needs a housekeeper, and not because I need someone to balance my books. Though God knows you're better at both than I ever gave you credit for at that gate. I'm asking because I love you plain and complete, and I don't want to spend one more day of my life pretending otherwise." Abigail's eyes filled, and for a moment she couldn't speak at all. The weight of 6 months of grief, and $11 and a torn hem, and 30 days of trial, all rising up at once, colliding with the astonishing, undeserved gift of a man kneeling in a mended kitchen, asking her to stay not out of necessity, but out of love. "Yes," she said, and the word came out rough half-laugh and half-sob, entirely unguarded. "Yes, Caleb, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her, then slow and certain, and when they finally broke apart, both of them laughing through tears, neither had expected. Abigail thought of the woman who had climbed down off that stagecoach with nothing but a sewing case and a foreclosure notice, and marveled at how completely that woman had been rebuilt piece by careful piece, same as every broken board and every ruined ledger line this ranch had handed her since. News of the engagement spread through the valley faster than the news of Cutter's arrest had, and this time the talk carried nothing but warmth. Women who had once whispered about curses, now stopping Abigail in the street, to offer congratulations, to ask what she'd wear, to share small gifts of preserves and mended linens that felt in their own quiet way like a whole community, finally admitting they'd been wrong about her from the start. Eleanor cried when she heard gripping Abigail so tight it nearly hurt. "I watched you climb down off that coach months ago, looking like the world had already finished with you," Eleanor said, wiping at her eyes. "I am so glad the world was wrong." "I couldn't have done any of it without you," Abigail said. "The evidence, the courage to speak up, all of it. You gave me somewhere to belong before Caleb ever did." "Then let me give you one more thing," Eleanor said, straightening businesslike again despite her wet eyes. "My mother's wedding dress. It'll need altering. You're built sturdier through the shoulders than she was, but the lace alone is worth more than anything the dress shops in town could offer, and I'd be honored to see it worn by a woman who earned her happiness the hard way, same as I did once before I lost mine." Abigail altered the dress herself over the following 2 weeks, evenings spent with needle and thread instead of ledger and pencil, and found working the fine old lace, with careful stitches, that sewing had never once stopped being the thing she was good at. It had simply waited patient for a reason worth the mending. It was during one of those quiet evenings, needle moving steady through old lace, that Caleb found her crying softly over the half-finished dress and sat down beside her without asking why, the way he'd learned to do over the months since her arrival. "I keep thinking of him," she admitted before he could ask. "My first husband. He would have liked you, I think. He would have appreciated a man who checks his own ledgers twice instead of trusting a stranger's word." "You don't have to apologize for missing him," Caleb said. "I'd think less of you if marrying me made you forget him entirely." "I'm not forgetting him," Abigail said. "I think I'm finally allowing myself to grieve him properly, instead of just surviving the grief the way I've been doing since the funeral. There's a difference. I didn't understand that until this valley gave me somewhere safe enough to feel it." "Then feel it," Caleb said simply. "I'm not in any hurry. He gave you 9 good years from what you've told me. That deserves proper mourning, not a hasty burial of the feeling just because a wedding's coming." She wept a while longer, and he sat with her through it, saying nothing more, simply present. And when the tears finally passed, she picked the needle back up and kept working the lace, feeling lighter than she had in months, as though naming the grief plainly had loosened some knot she hadn't realized she was still carrying. "Thank you," she said eventually, "for not needing me to be finished grieving before you'd let yourself love me." "I buried a wife too," Caleb said quietly. "I know the shape of what you're carrying. I'd never ask you to set it down faster than it wants to be set down. Some things need their full season." The wedding was set for the first Saturday of October, when the worst of the heat had finally broken, and the valley had turned gold and green with the particular richness that follows a hard summer's rain. And preparations moved forward with a momentum that left Abigail breathless in the good way, the way that came from being surrounded for the first time in longer than she could remember by people who wanted to help rather than people who wanted to judge. 2 nights before the wedding, dark clouds rolled in fast over the ridge, and Caleb stood at the porch rail watching them build with a frown that made Abigail's stomach drop. "Storm's coming," he said. "Bad one by the look of that sky. If it holds through Saturday, we'll be standing vows in the mud or moving the whole thing into a kitchen too small to hold half the guests we've invited." "Then we'll stand vows in the mud," Abigail said, "and be married just the same. I didn't survive a drought and a courtroom and a man who tried to burn down everything we built just to let weather decide whether I get to marry you." He looked at her, and something in his tense shoulders eased at the certainty in her voice. "You're not worried?" "I've spent an entire summer learning what's actually worth worrying about," she said. "Rain isn't on that list anymore, not after everything else." The storm broke hard that night, thunder rolling long across the valley, rain hammering the roof loud enough to wake them both twice, and Abigail lay awake in the dark beside the man she was 2 days from marrying, listening to the storm and finding to her own surprise that she felt no fear in it at all. Only the strange, settled comfort of weathering something difficult beside someone who wasn't going anywhere. By dawn, the storm had passed as quickly as it came, leaving the valley washed clean and glistening, the sky scrubbed to a brilliant cloudless blue that held not the faintest threat of rain through the whole of the following day, and Eleanor, arriving early to help with final preparations, declared it nothing short of providence. "The land clearing itself out just in time," she said, surveying the damp, gleaming grass. Almost like it wanted to give you both a proper start. Almost like it did? Abigail agreed, and found she believed it a little after everything. But even joy that autumn could not entirely outrun the last echo of Harlan Cutter's reach. 6 days before the wedding, a letter arrived from Reyes with news that stopped Abigail's heart cold for the length of one terrible breath. Cutter, awaiting trial, had somehow managed to bribe a guard and attempt escape from the territorial jail, making it as far as the stable yard before being caught and subdued, and in the chaos of his capture, he had shouted loud enough for several witnesses to hear, and later repeat a threat naming both Caleb and Abigail, directly promising that if he went down, he intended to make sure they remembered exactly why they should have taken his money and disappeared when he'd offered them the chance. "It's an empty threat," Reyes wrote, "made by a desperate man now facing additional charges for attempted escape and bribery of a territorial officer. I've requested increased security around both of you until sentencing purely as precaution. I do not believe he has any remaining resources to act on what he shouted in a moment of fury, but I would be remiss not to warn you plainly." Caleb read the letter twice, jaw tight, and then folded it carefully and set it on the table between them. "We're not letting him take this from us," he said. "Not the wedding, not one more day of peace." "I'm not frightened of him anymore," Abigail said, and found saying it aloud that it was entirely true. "He's a man in a cell now awaiting a trial he cannot buy his way out of. Whatever threats he shouts in the stable yard are the sound of a man who has already lost everything that used to make him dangerous." "You're certain?" "I've spent an entire summer being afraid of Harlan Cutter," she said. "I find I have no more fear left to give him. Only the wedding, Caleb. Only you." He looked at her a long moment, something fierce and grateful working behind his eyes, and then he pulled her close and held her, and neither of them spoke of Cutter again in the days that followed, because there was simply too much else worth their attention. The dress, the flowers. Eleanor insisted on gathering herself from the pasture that had nearly burned twice that summer, the small handful of guests who would gather at the ranch itself rather than the church in town, since Caleb had insisted quiet and certain that he wanted to marry her on the land she had rebuilt with her own 2 hands. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and cool, the first true breath of autumn settling over the valley, and Abigail stood in the small room off the kitchen, the same narrow room she'd been given as hired help all those months ago, transformed now with borrowed mirrors, and Eleanor's careful hands pinning the altered lace into place, and looked at her reflection with something like disbelief. "You look nothing like the woman who climbed off that coach," Eleanor said, fussing with the final pins. "I feel nothing like her," Abigail admitted. "And everything like her both at once. I don't think I could have gotten here without having been her first." "That's usually how it works," Eleanor said gently. "The breaking comes first. The building only happens after." Outside, the small gathering had assembled beneath the open sky, the 2 remaining hired hands who had stayed loyal through drought and fire, both Reyes himself having ridden the long distance specifically for the occasion, several of the ranchers whose notes had once carried Cutter's fraudulent hand, and who now stood as neighbors rather than strangers, and Eleanor standing close at Abigail's side as she walked the short distance from the porch to where Caleb waited. He watched her cross that short stretch of mended ground with an expression she would carry with her the rest of her life, not the flat suspicion of a man testing a stranger at a gate, but the open, unguarded wonder of a man who had spent 6 years convinced this particular kind of happiness was closed to him forever and had been proven joyfully wrong. The preacher's words passed quickly, both of them too full of the moment to fully register the formal language until it came time for the vows themselves, and Caleb spoke as plain and steady, same as he did everything. "I promise to fix what's breaking, same as you taught me to," he said, "and to let you fix what's breaking in me for as long as we both shall live." He paused, and something in his throat worked before he continued quieter, now meant more for her than for the gathered witnesses. "I stood at that gate 3 months ago and asked you if you could manage a house, or if you'd slow me down, and I have never in my life been so wrong about anyone as I was wrong about you that afternoon. You didn't slow me down, Abigail. You caught me before I fell all the way through the floor. This ranch had been rotting beneath me for years. I don't know how to thank a person properly for that. I only know how to promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying." Abigail, when her turn came, found her voice steadier than she expected. "I came to this land with $11 and a torn hem," she said, expecting 30 days before being sent away. "I found instead a home, a family, and a man who saw past every assumption the world ever made about me. I promise to stay. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because there is nowhere else I would rather be." She glanced down at her hands, steady now. The fence wire scars faded to thin pale lines against her skin, and thought of the needle that had gone through her thumb the night before her stagecoach ride, the small, sharp pain she'd swallowed rather than let slow her down. "I've spent my whole life being told what a woman shaped like me is and isn't capable of," she continued. Unplanned, the words rising up from somewhere honest and unguarded. "I stopped believing most of it a long time ago. But some small part of me still flinched every time a stranger's eyes measured me and found me wanting. Caleb never once measured me that way. Not after the first afternoon. I promised to spend every day of this marriage returning that same clear sight to him, and to anyone else this valley still needs reminding not to underestimate." When Caleb kissed her, the small gathering erupted into the kind of warm, unrestrained cheering that only comes from people who have watched two individuals earn their happiness the hard way. And Abigail, laughing and crying at once, felt the last of her old grief finally settle into something gentler, not gone, never entirely gone, but transformed the way rot transforms into rich soil once it's been properly cleared away, making room for something new to grow in its place. Reyes stood to offer a toast once the meal had settled, raising a cup of cider with the particular formality of a man unaccustomed to speaking outside a courtroom. "I've spent 20 years watching powerful men take advantage of people who had no way to fight back," he said. "I want you all to remember this day, and remember that it happened because one woman refused to believe she had no way to fight back. Mrs. Decker." He inclined his head toward Abigail, and something in the formal use of her new name made her chest tighten with a fierce, grateful joy. "You didn't just save this ranch. You reminded an entire valley what's possible when somebody decides to look closely at what everyone else agreed to stop questioning." The gathered guests raised their cups, and Eleanor, standing beside Abigail, squeezed her hand tight enough to ache. "He's not wrong," Eleanor whispered. "None of us questioned Cutter for years. It took a stranger with nothing left to lose to show us we'd been afraid of a man who was never as powerful as he wanted us to believe." That evening, as the small gathering shared supper on tables set up in the yard, word arrived by Ryder Reyes, again, unable to resist sending news even on their wedding day, that Cutter's trial date had been moved up following his failed escape attempt, and that the territorial prosecutor now expected a swift conviction given the weight of evidence, the sabotage confession, and the fresh charges of bribery and attempted flight. Caleb read the letter aloud to the assembled guests, and a quiet, satisfied murmur passed through the gathering. Not celebration exactly. This was still a valley that had suffered under Cutter's hand for years, but something closer to relief, the particular relief of watching a long-carried weight finally set down for good. The actual conviction came 3 weeks into their marriage, delivered by Reyes himself, riding out on a crisp November morning with a paper that made Caleb whoop loud enough to startle the horses in the newly rebuilt barn. 12 years, Reyes announced, swinging down from his horse with a grin wider than Abigail had ever seen on him. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy, sabotage, bribery, and attempted flight all counted separately. Judge Alden showed no mercy whatsoever, and I don't believe he intended to. Said in his ruling that a man who poisons a shared water source to win a financial dispute has forfeited any claim to leniency this territory might otherwise extend. 12 years, Abigail repeated, letting the number settle fully into her chest, feeling something long and tightly wound finally completely unspool. The Whitfield's claim was included in the sentencing too, Reyes added, and Eleanor's. Every ranch he ever cheated gets restitution paid out of what remains of his assets once the territory finishes seizing them. It's not everything anyone lost. Money rarely replaces what fraud actually takes, but it's more justice than this valley has seen in longer than most of us can remember. Eleanor, standing nearby, pressed a hand to her mouth, tears bright in her eyes. "My husband would have wept to hear it," she said softly. "I think I'm weeping enough for the both of us." "You earned every bit of that restitution," Abigail said, taking her hand. "Same as I did. Same as the Whitfields did wherever they've settled now." Reyes stayed for supper that evening. The fourth such visit that had turned over the months from professional obligation into genuine friendship, and as the lamp burned low over a table crowded with people who had once been strangers and were now simply family. Abigail looked around at all of it, Caleb's hand resting easy over hers. Eleanor laughing at something Reyes had said. The mended chair sitting solid at its place. The ledger closed and settled in a drawer where it no longer needed nightly attention, and felt fully and without reservation that she had built exactly the life worth every hard mile it had taken to reach. Abigail Decker had come to this valley a widow, with $11 and a torn hem, expecting only 30 days before the world sent her away again. She had sewn that hem tight the night before she ever laid eyes on the Decker gate hands, shaking thumb bleeding certain that tomorrow's stranger would take one look at her, and find her wanting the way every stranger before him always had. She had found instead a home worth defending, a fight worth winning, and a love worth every hard mile it had taken to earn. She had learned that a needle through the thumb was nothing compared to the wounds a person could survive when they finally stopped running from them, the loss of a husband, the loss of a house, the slow, patient work of proving her worth to a man who had once asked flatly whether she'd slow him down. She had not slowed him down. She had rebuilt everything